He hadn't spoken to another human being in 11 months. The last words he'd said out loud were, "Get off my land," to a county inspector who'd made the mistake of driving up the dirt road without warning. Before that, silence. Just the wind through dead corn stalks and Axel's breathing beside him at night. Daniel Brooks had built his quiet like a fortress. Every brick laid with intention, every wall designed to keep the world exactly where he wanted it, far away. But on the coldest night in October, a pregnant woman appeared at his gate, and she didn't ask for help. She offered to work. And that single moment, that one stubborn act of pride from a stranger who had no business being on a dying farm in the middle of nowhere, Christ, that changed everything. If this story hits you the way it hit me, do me a favor. Smash that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you. Part 1. The truck had died 6 miles back. Charlotte Vance stood on the shoulder of a road she couldn't name, in a county she'd never heard of, staring at the hood of a 2004 Ford Ranger that was bleeding transmission fluid onto gravel like a gut-shot animal. She didn't cry. She didn't kick the tire or scream into the dark the way she might have done 3 years ago, back when she still believed the universe owed her something. She just stood there, one hand on the curve of her belly, the other holding a gas station map she'd picked up 2 states ago, and she breathed. 7 months pregnant, 30 years old, net worth, on paper, somewhere north of $2 billion. And not a single person on this planet she could call. The irony wasn't lost on her. She folded the map, tucked it into the pocket of her oversized canvas jacket, a man's jacket, bought for $4 at a Goodwill outside Roanoke, and started walking. The road was narrow, unlined, no streetlights, just the kind of forgotten 2-lane that existed in rural Virginia like a scar the county had stopped bothering to stitch. Trees pressed in on both sides, bare-limbed and skeletal, against a sky that couldn't decide between storm clouds and stars. Her boots were wrong for this. Ballet flats would have been worse, but the work boots she'd grabbed at a thrift store in Tennessee were a half size too big and rubbed raw against her left heel with every step. She'd stuffed newspaper in the toes 3 days ago. The newspaper was wet now. Everything was wet. The October air carried that particular kind of cold that didn't hit you all at once. It crept. It started at the fingers and the ears and worked inward until your chest felt tight and your thoughts started moving slower than they should. She walked for 40 minutes before she saw the mailbox. It was leaning hard to the left, like something had backed into it years ago, and nobody had cared enough to fix it. No name on it, no number. Just a dented metal box on a rotting wooden post, and beyond it, a dirt driveway that disappeared uphill into darkness. She could barely make out the shape of a house at the top. No lights, no movement, just a blocky silhouette against the charcoal sky. Charlotte stopped. Common sense said, keep walking, find a gas station, find a church, find anywhere with fluorescent lighting and a person behind a counter who'd let her sit down and use a phone. But her feet were throbbing, the baby was pressing hard against her bladder, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. She'd slept in the truck the last 2 nights. Before that, a rest stop bathroom outside Knoxville, where she'd locked herself in a handicapped stall and sat on the floor with her back against the wall until dawn. She turned up the driveway. The gravel crunched under her boots, loud in the silence, almost obscenely loud. She was halfway up when the dog hit. Not literally, but the sound hit first, a deep guttural bark that started somewhere in the darkness ahead and rolled downhill toward her like a physical thing, not the yapping of a house pet. This was something else, something trained. The bark had structure to it, rhythm, a controlled aggression that said, I see you and I'm deciding what to do about it. Charlotte stopped walking. She didn't run. Running from a dog like that was the worst thing you could do. She knew that much. She stood still, both hands visible, and waited. The dog materialized out of the dark like smoke taking shape. A Belgian Malinois, lean and hard-muscled, with a coat the color of burnt caramel, and eyes that caught whatever faint light existed and threw it back sharp. He stopped 10 feet from her, legs planted wide, ears forward, every line of his body saying the same thing as Bark had said. Explain yourself. Hey, Charlotte said quietly. I'm not here to cause trouble. The dog didn't move. His lips pulled back slightly. Not a full snarl, but a warning. A preview. A porch light snapped on. Charlotte squinted against it. The house was worse than she'd imagined from the road. A two-story farmhouse that had probably been beautiful once, maybe 50 years ago, when someone still loved it. Now the paint was peeling in long curls, the porch railing was missing 3 balusters, and the front steps had the kind of sag that meant the wood underneath was rotting from moisture. A window on the second floor was covered with plywood. The gutters hung loose on the east side like broken arms. But there was a man on the porch. He stood just inside the cone of yellow light, one hand on the doorframe, the other hanging at his side in a way that was too relaxed to be casual. He was tall, 6'1", maybe 6'2", with the kind of build that came from physical labor, not a gym. Broad shoulders, thick forearms, a neck that looked like it had been designed to hold up something heavier than a head. His hair was dark, cut short, but not military short anymore, grown out just enough to suggest he'd stopped caring about regulations. His face was hard to read in the porch light. Sharp jaw, deep-set eyes, a mouth that looked like it hadn't smiled in a long time and wasn't planning to start. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. Charlotte swallowed. "My truck broke down about 3 miles east. I saw your mailbox from the road." Nothing. The man's expression didn't change. The dog held position between them like a checkpoint. "I'm not asking for a ride," she continued, and she hated how thin her voice sounded in the cold air. She straightened her shoulders. "I'm not asking for money. I can work. If you've got a barn or an outbuilding where I can sleep tonight, I'll earn it. I can clean, cook, fix things, whatever you need." The man's eyes moved, just slightly, down to her belly, then back to her face. "You're pregnant," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like a machine that hadn't been started in months. "I'm aware." Something flickered across his face, not amusement exactly, not warmth, more like recognition, the look of someone who'd just been surprised and didn't appreciate it. "Axel," he said. The dog's ears rotated. "Hier." The Malinois held for one more second, one more long, evaluating second, then turned and trotted back to the porch, taking up position at the man's feet. But his eyes never left Charlotte. She could feel them on her like heat. "There's a room upstairs," the man said. "Radiator works about half the time, blankets in the closet." He paused. "You can stay tonight. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." He turned and walked back inside without waiting for her to respond. Charlotte stood in the driveway for a long moment, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Then she climbed the porch steps, carefully, because the third one groaned like it might give, and walked through the front door of a stranger's house. The inside was exactly what the outside promised. Neglected, but not destroyed. A living room with a sagging couch, a wood-burning stove that was putting out more smoke than heat, and stacks of books on the floor that had no organizational logic she could identify. The kitchen was through an archway. She could see a sink full of dishes, a refrigerator that hummed too loud, and a table with one chair. One chair. Like even the furniture had given up pretending anyone else was coming. Daniel Brooks, though she wouldn't learn his name until the next morning, was already halfway up the stairs. He moved quietly for a big man, deliberately, the kind of quiet that was trained into people, not born. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall," he said over his shoulder. "Water takes about 2 minutes to get hot. Don't use the left faucet on the sink. It's stripped." "Thank you." He stopped on the landing and turned around. In the dim hallway light, she could see his face more clearly now. He was younger than she'd first thought, early 30s maybe, but his eyes were older, much older. They had the look of someone who'd seen things that didn't fade with time, things that had taken up permanent residence behind his pupils and weren't paying rent. "Lock your door," he said. "From what?" His jaw tightened. "Habit." Then he disappeared into a room at the far end of the hall and closed the door. She heard the click of a lock, then nothing. Charlotte found the room he'd mentioned, small, cold, with a single bed pushed against the wall and a window that looked out over what she assumed was the back of the property, though all she could see was darkness. The radiator was, as advertised, working at about 50% capacity. She found the closet, pulled out 2 wool blankets that smelled like cedar and dust, and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time in 3 days, she was inside. Walls around her, a ceiling above, a door she could close. She pressed both hands against her belly and felt Elias, she'd already named him, had been calling him that since the second ultrasound, the one she'd gone to alone. She felt him shift and kick against her palm. "We're okay," she whispered. "We're okay for now." She didn't believe it, but she said it anyway, because that's what you do when you're the only person responsible for a life that hasn't started yet. You lie gently and hope the universe doesn't call your bluff. Daniel didn't sleep. He lay on his bed, fully dressed, boots still on, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle. The old pipes groaning, the wind pressing against the windows. And somewhere down the hall, the faint creak of bed springs as a stranger shifted in a bed he'd never expected anyone to sleep in. What the hell had he just done? Axel was on the floor beside him, chin on paws, eyes open. The dog hadn't relaxed since the woman arrived. Every few minutes, his ears would swivel toward the hallway, tracking sounds that Daniel couldn't hear, running threat assessments that were hardwired into his nervous system. "I know," Daniel said quietly. "I don't like it either." Axel's tail gave one slow sweep across the floor. Not agreement, acknowledgement. Daniel had bought this farm 3 years ago with cash, what was left of his savings after the discharge, after the apartment in Virginia Beach he'd let go, after he'd stopped answering phone calls from everyone he'd ever known. 62 acres of nothing in the Blue Ridge foothills. The previous owner had been dead for 2 years before the county got around to listing it. The house was a wreck, the barn was worse, and the fields hadn't been worked in over a decade. It was, by any reasonable standard, a terrible investment. It was also exactly what he'd wanted, a place where no one would come looking for him, because there was nothing here worth finding. He'd spent the first year doing just enough to keep the house standing, patching the roof, replacing the water heater, clearing the brush from around the foundation so the termites would have to work harder. He hadn't fixed the porch railing. He hadn't painted. He'd done the minimum required to survive and nothing more, because survival was the only contract he'd signed with himself, and he intended to honor it to the letter. Before the farm, there'd been 12 years in the Navy. Before that didn't matter. He'd enlisted at 18 out of a high school in Wheeling, West Virginia, with a 3.1 GPA, no money, and a father whose only contribution to his upbringing was a comprehensive education in what not to become. Bud/S at 20. 2 deployments by 22, 6 more over the next decade. The specifics didn't matter. They never did. To anyone who hadn't been there, and to anyone who had, you didn't need to explain. What mattered was what came after. What came after was a debrief room at Joint Base Little Creek, a naval psychologist who kept saying the word processing like it was a magic spell, and a piece of paper that said honorable discharge in language that was carefully designed to say nothing about the reasons behind it. What came after was 9 months of insomnia, a prescription for Ambien he'd filled once and then flushed down the toilet, and a growing certainty that the person he'd been trained to be was fundamentally incompatible with the world he'd been trained to protect. So he'd left. Not dramatically, not with a manifesto or a breakdown or a scene. He just stopped. Stopped returning calls, stopped going to the VA. Stopped pretending that the transition back to civilian life was something that could be accomplished with a pamphlet and a follow-up appointment. He'd found Axel at a kennel in North Carolina, a retired military working dog who'd been deemed too reactive for adoption after biting a handler during a routine evaluation. Daniel had walked in, looked at the dog, and recognized something in those amber eyes that he'd seen in his own mirror every morning. A creature who'd been built for a purpose, had that purpose removed, and was now expected to be something softer without any instructions on how. He'd signed the papers the same day. He and Axel had been alone together ever since, until tonight. Daniel turned his head and looked at the bedroom door. Locked, as always. Not because he was afraid of what might come in, but because the ritual of locking it was one of the few structures he had left. A small, controllable act in a life that had, for a long time, felt like one long, uncontrollable freefall. A pregnant woman. On his farm. In his house. He should have said no. Every instinct he'd developed over 32 years of learning not to trust people had been screaming at him to say no, to point her back toward the road, to tell her there was a town 8 miles south where someone else could deal with her problem. But he'd looked at her standing there in the cold. Thin jacket, bad boots, belly round under canvas, chin up like she was daring the world to feel sorry for her. And something in the back of his brain had short-circuited. Not sympathy, exactly. He didn't do sympathy. It was more like recognition. The same thing he'd seen in Axel's eyes, but in human form. Someone who was refusing to break, even though every circumstance suggested they should. One night, he told the ceiling. Then she's gone. Axel sighed, a long, skeptical exhalation through his nose. Don't start. Morning came gray and reluctant, the kind of Virginia dawn that looked like the sky was still arguing about whether it was worth the effort. Daniel was already up. He was always already up, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of black coffee, watching the mist settle into the hollows between the hills. Axel was at the back door, nose pressed to the gap between the door and the frame, cataloging every scent the morning had brought. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, slow, careful, one hand on the railing. He could tell by the rhythm. Then she appeared in the kitchen doorway, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the flat morning light, two strangers who had made a temporary arrangement and were now trying to figure out what came next. She looked worse in daylight. Not worse, exactly. Clearer. The oversized jacket couldn't hide how thin she was, not in a fashionable way, but in a way that said she hadn't been eating enough for too long. Her hair, dark brown, almost black, was pulled back in a ponytail that had gone sideways during the night. There were circles under her eyes that looked permanent, like bruises that had given up trying to heal. But she was standing straight, shoulders back, that chin again. Coffee's on the stove, Daniel said. I don't drink coffee. It's not good for... She stopped, touched her belly. Do you have tea? No. Water's fine. He gestured toward the tap with his mug. She crossed the kitchen, took a glass from the dish rack. It was the only clean one, and filled it. She drank the entire glass without stopping, then filled it again. When's the last time you ate? He asked, and the question came out harder than he'd intended. Not concerned, accusatory. Like her hunger was an inconvenience he hadn't signed up for. Her jaw tightened. Yesterday morning, there was a gas station outside. Sit down. I'm fine, I told you. I can work. If you show me what needs doing, I'll... Sit. Down. She sat. Not because he'd told her to, he could see that in her eyes, the flash of resistance, the quick calculation, but because her body made the decision for her. Her legs were tired, her back ached, the baby was heavy. Physics won the argument that pride was trying to lose. Daniel opened the refrigerator. It wasn't well stocked. A man living alone on a farm didn't keep a full kitchen. But there were eggs, half a loaf of bread that was still on the right side of stale, and butter. He pulled out a cast iron skillet, set it on the burner, and started cracking eggs. I didn't ask for that, Charlotte said from the table. I know. I meant what I said last night. I can earn my keep. Eat first, then we'll talk about earning. She went quiet. He cooked 4 eggs, scrambled because they were easier and he didn't know how she liked them, and 2 slices of toast. He put the plate in front of her without ceremony, then leaned against the counter and drank his coffee. She ate like she was trying not to eat fast. Controlled bites, measured chewing, the kind of forced calm that told him she was hungrier than she wanted him to know. He watched without watching. A skill the Navy had taught him, peripheral awareness disguised as disinterest. Axel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at Daniel. He looked at the plate. Then he walked to his usual spot by the wood stove, turned 3 circles, and lay down. But he kept his head up, and his eyes stayed on the woman at the table. Your dog doesn't like me, Charlotte said between bites. He doesn't like anyone. Does he have a name? Axel. Axel. She said it carefully, testing the weight of it. Then, to the dog, I'm not going to hurt him, you know. Axel's ears flattened, not aggression, confusion. He wasn't used to being spoken to by anyone other than Daniel. The sound of a female voice directed at him seemed to create a processing error he didn't have a protocol for. "Don't talk to him," Daniel said. "He's not a pet." "What is he?" "A dog." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, and something almost like amusement crossed her face. Almost. It didn't quite make it. "You're not great at conversation, are you?" "No?" "Okay." She went back to her eggs. Todd. They had the conversation after she'd finished eating and washed her own plate. She insisted on that, and he let her, because the alternative was an argument he didn't have the energy for. They sat on the front porch, him on the top step, her on the bench by the railing, Axel positioned exactly between them like a furry mediator. The morning mist was burning off slowly, revealing the property in pieces. The barn, leaning 15 degrees from vertical and missing half its roof. The fenced pasture where nothing had grazed in years. The fields beyond choked with weeds and volunteer saplings. An old tractor rusting near the tree line, its tires flat and cracked. "This place needs work," Charlotte said. "I know what it needs." "I'm not criticizing, I'm offering." He turned to look at her. In the daylight, with the porch framing her, she looked both younger and harder than she had the night before. The thinness he had noticed in the kitchen was more pronounced out here, cheekbones too sharp, wrists too narrow. But her hands were resting on her knees, palms down, fingers relaxed. No fidgeting, no nervous energy, just stillness. "I don't know you," Daniel said. "I know. I don't know where you came from, or why you're here, or what you're running from. And I'm not going to ask, because it's not my business. But I need to know one thing." He paused. "Is someone going to come looking for you?" Something changed behind her eyes, a door closing, a light going off. "Not anytime soon." "That's not the same as no." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He studied her. She held his gaze, didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't offer an explanation she hadn't been asked for. That bothered him more than it should have, because people who could hold a stare like that either had nothing to hide or had been hiding things so long it had become a resting state. "Here's the deal," he said. "You can stay in the upstairs room. There's a woodpile behind the barn that needs splitting and stacking. Not for you, not in your condition, but there's 100 other things that need doing around here that don't require an axe. Kitchen's a disaster. The pantry hasn't been organized since I moved in. The back bedroom's full of boxes I haven't opened. The whole house needs cleaning, and I haven't had the—" He stopped. He'd almost said motivation. He changed it. "Haven't gotten to it. In exchange for room and board. Room and whatever food's here. I go into town once a week for supplies. I'll get more now that there's—" He gestured vaguely at her. "More." Charlotte's mouth twitched. "More. That's charming." "I'm not trying to be charming." "I can see that." She stood, slowly, one hand bracing against the bench, and looked out over the farm. The morning light caught her face in profile, and for a second Daniel saw something under the exhaustion and the careful composure that he couldn't quite name. Determination, maybe. Or desperation wearing determination's clothes. "I have 2 conditions," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "First, I'm not a charity case. I work, you provide shelter and food. This is a transaction. If I'm not pulling my weight, tell me and I'll go." "Fine." "Second, don't ask about the baby's father. Don't ask about my past. Don't ask why I'm here. When I'm ready to tell you, if I ever am, I will. Until then, it's off limits." Daniel almost laughed. Almost. "Lady, I've been living alone on 62 acres for 3 years. I'm the last person who's going to ask about your personal life." "Good." She turned back to him and extended her hand. "Charlotte." He looked at her hand. Thin fingers, short nails, a callus on her right palm that seemed out of place on someone who looked like her. He shook it. Her grip was firm, too firm for her size, compensating for something. "Daniel." "Daniel." She nodded once. "Where do you keep the cleaning supplies?" Quotes. She started that afternoon. Daniel had expected, he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Someone who'd poke around for an hour, get tired, and retreat to the bedroom. Someone who'd need direction, encouragement, supervision. Someone who'd make a show of effort and then settle into being a guest. Charlotte was none of those things. She found the cleaning supplies under the kitchen sink, a collection of half-used bottles that Daniel had bought at various points over 3 years and never used in any systematic way, and she went to work like the house had personally offended her. She started in the kitchen, and within 2 hours the space looked like it belonged to a different house. Dishes washed and stacked, counters scrubbed, the refrigerator emptied, cleaned, and restocked with the items that were still edible, the floor mopped. The window over the sink, which had been so grimy Daniel had forgotten it was a window, now let in actual light. He watched from the living room, pretending to read a book about soil erosion he'd been pretending to read for 6 months. He watched her move through the kitchen with a kind of focused intensity that he recognized from a completely different context. She had a system. She wasn't just cleaning, she was conquering territory, room by room, surface by surface, establishing order in a space where chaos had been the default for too long. Axel watched too. The dog had relocated from the wood stove to the kitchen doorway, where he lay with his chin on the threshold, tracking Charlotte's movements with the intensity of a CCTV camera. Every time she got close to him, he'd tense. Every time she moved away, he'd relax. He was building a behavioral profile, Daniel realized, cataloging patterns, establishing baseline. "Your dog is staring at me," Charlotte called from the kitchen. "He does that. It's unnerving. He'll stop when he decides you're not a threat." "How long does that usually take?" Daniel thought about it. The mail carrier had been delivering to the farm for 2 years, and Axel still barked at the truck every single time. "Depends." Charlotte appeared in the archway, a dish towel over her shoulder, a smudge of something on her forehead. "On what?" "On whether you're a threat." She stared at him. Then she turned and went back to the kitchen. He thought he heard her mutter something under her breath, something that might have been ridiculous. But he couldn't be sure, and he didn't ask. By evening, the kitchen was unrecognizable, and Charlotte had moved on to the living room. "You don't have to do all of this today," Daniel said, standing in the hallway with a glass of water he'd been meaning to drink for 20 minutes. "I know." She was on her knees in front of the bookshelf, pulling books out and wiping down the shelves. Even at 7 months pregnant, she moved with a kind of stubborn efficiency that seemed to dare the physical limitations of her body to stop her. "You should rest. You've been going for 5 hours. "I'll rest when I'm tired." "You are tired. You've been tired since you got here." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. The smudge on her forehead had migrated to her cheek. Her ponytail had given up entirely. And there it was again. That thing in her eyes. That refusal. That steel-reinforced unwillingness to accept help in any form that looked like sympathy. "Daniel," she said, "I appreciate the concern. I do. But I've been taking care of myself for a long time, and I'm not going to stop because someone thinks a pregnant woman should be sitting down." "I don't think that." "Then what do you think?" He didn't answer, because the truth was, he didn't know what he thought. He didn't know why he'd let her stay, or why watching her clean his house was creating a feeling in his chest that he didn't have a name for, or why the fact that she was here, another person, another heartbeat, another set of footsteps in the hallway, was simultaneously the most unsettling and the most grounding thing that had happened to him in 3 years. "I think," he said slowly, "that you should eat something before it gets dark. I'll cook." "You cook?" "I can make about 4 things. One of them's edible." That almost smile again. Closer this time. Still didn't quite arrive, but closer. "Which one?" "Chili, but I'm out of beans, so it's really just meat and tomato sauce." "That sounds terrible." "It is." She used the bookshelf to pull herself to her feet. "I'll cook." "You don't have to." "I want to. Consider it part of the arrangement." She walked past him toward the kitchen, pausing in the doorway. "Do you have onions, garlic, any spices at all?" "There might be paprika. It's been in the cabinet since before I moved in." "So it's about 7 years old." "At least." She shook her head and disappeared into the kitchen. A minute later, he heard cabinets opening and closing, the clink of pots, the sound of a faucet running. Then her voice, quiet but clear. "I can work with this." Dinner was pasta with a sauce made from canned tomatoes, the ancient paprika, salt, pepper, and something she'd done with butter and garlic that he couldn't explain, but that made the entire kitchen smell like a place where someone actually lived. They ate at the table, so he'd brought in a second chair from the porch. And for the first time in longer than he could calculate, Daniel ate a meal across from another person. It was uncomfortable in a way he hadn't anticipated. Not because she was difficult or demanding or overly talkative, the opposite. Charlotte ate quietly, efficiently, with the same focused intention she'd brought to cleaning. She didn't try to make conversation. She didn't ask questions. She just ate, and the silence between them was full of things neither of them was saying. Axel lay under the table. This was new. He normally ate in the kitchen and then went to his spot by the stove. But tonight he'd positioned himself under the table, equidistant from both chairs, like he was monitoring a negotiation he wasn't sure he trusted. "The food's good," Daniel said, because the silence was getting heavy and somebody had to say something. "Thank you." More silence. "You're a good cook." "I learned because I had to." A pause. "Not because I wanted to." He recognized the distinction. He'd learned a lot of things because he'd had to. How to shoot, how to move through hostile terrain, how to cauterize a wound with a hot knife, how to sleep with one eye open. None of it was because he'd wanted to. All of it was because the alternative was worse. "I get that," he said. She looked up from her plate. Their eyes met across the table, and for a second, just a second, something passed between them. Not attraction, not warmth, something more elemental. Recognition. Two people who had been shaped by necessity instead of choice, looking at each other across a table in a falling-apart farmhouse, and understanding, without words, that they were more similar than either of them wanted to admit. Then the moment passed. Charlotte looked back at her plate. Daniel reached for his water. Under the table, Axel sighed. The days after that settled into a pattern with surprising speed. Charlotte was up every morning before dawn. Daniel knew this because he was up before dawn too, and he'd hear her moving around the kitchen, the quiet sounds of water boiling and cabinet doors opening and closing with a care that said she was trying not to wake him. She didn't know he was already awake. He didn't tell her. She attacked the house with a methodical intensity that bordered on aggressive. The living room, the hallway, the back bedroom where she emptied and organized 17 boxes of things Daniel had packed when he'd moved in and never unpacked. Books, tools, old equipment, a few framed photographs that she found and set aside without comment, face down on a shelf. He noticed that. The way she handled the photographs, picking them up, glancing at them just long enough to register what they were, then placing them face down without asking who the people were or what the images meant. She was honoring the boundary she'd set at the beginning, the one about not asking, but she was doing it so naturally, so instinctively, that Daniel began to wonder if the boundary wasn't really about protecting him at all. Maybe it was about protecting herself. Maybe she knew that if she started asking questions, she'd have to answer some too. The farm started to change, not in dramatic ways. She wasn't rebuilding the barn or plowing the fields, but in small, accumulating shifts that were harder to ignore the more they piled up. The kitchen curtains, which had been hanging crooked for 2 years, were straightened and washed. The front porch was swept. The firewood, which Daniel kept in a haphazard pile by the back door, was restacked into a neat, tight formation. A vase appeared on the kitchen table. A mason jar, actually, with dried wildflowers she'd found somewhere on the property. It was, Daniel thought, like watching someone perform CPR on a house. Gentle compressions, steady rhythm. Waiting for a heartbeat. He tried not to care. He tried to maintain the same emotional distance he'd kept for 3 years, the carefully constructed apathy that had been his most reliable survival mechanism since leaving the Navy. But it was hard to maintain apathy when someone was putting flowers on your table and the kitchen smelled like garlic, and the living room had throw pillows that hadn't been there a week ago. Where did she even get throw pillows? They were on a farm in the middle of nowhere. There was no throw pillow store. He found them on the couch one evening after coming in from checking the perimeter, a habit he'd never been able to break. The nightly walk around the property with Axel, checking fence lines and sight lines and 100 other things that didn't need checking but that his brain required in order to sleep. "Where did those come from?" he asked, pointing at the couch. Charlotte was in the kitchen, washing dishes. The closet in the back bedroom. There were 4 of them in a box. I didn't know those were there. Clearly. He stood in the living room looking at the pillows and felt something shift inside him, something small and tectonic. The house looked occupied. It looked like someone lived here. Not just survived here, not just used it as a shelter between one empty day and the next, but lived here. And the terrifying part was that he didn't hate it. Axel's behavior was shifting too, and that was harder to ignore because Axel didn't do anything accidentally. The dog had moved from active suspicion to passive surveillance. He no longer positioned himself between Daniel and Charlotte like a barrier. Instead, he'd started choosing spots that gave him sightlines on both of them simultaneously. The kitchen doorway when they were in different rooms, the space between the couch and the table when they were in the same one. On the fifth night, Charlotte dropped a pan. It slipped from her wet hands and hit the kitchen floor with a sharp metallic crash. Daniel flinched, a full-body flinch that started in his shoulders and ran down through his hands. An involuntary response he hadn't been able to train out, no matter how hard he'd tried. He was in the living room, and the sound hit him like a flashbang, and for one disorienting second he wasn't in a farmhouse in Virginia, he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere hot and loud and wrong. When he came back, 1 second, maybe 2, though it felt like a year, Charlotte was standing in the kitchen doorway, pan in hand, watching him with an expression that was careful and quiet and contained no pity whatsoever. "Sorry about the pan," she said. "It's fine. I should have dried my hands first. It's fine." She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see that she understood what had just happened. She understood it completely, and she was making a deliberate choice not to address it, not to ask, not to turn it into a moment of vulnerability that would make him feel exposed. She just nodded, turned, and went back to the kitchen. Under the table, Axel shifted. His tail brushed against Daniel's ankle, a touch so brief it could have been accidental. It wasn't. Daniel sat in the quiet living room and breathed. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees, making them creak and sway like old men shifting in their chairs. The farmhouse settled around him, pipes groaning, wood contracting in the cold, the sounds of a structure that was old and tired and still, somehow standing. Charlotte was humming in the kitchen, something low and tuneless, barely audible over the sound of running water. He didn't recognize the melody. He wasn't sure there was one, but the sound filled the space between the walls in a way that silence never had, and Daniel Brooks sat in the living room of his dying farm and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that wasn't emptiness. He didn't know what to call it. He wasn't sure he wanted to. But Axel's tail touched his ankle again, and the humming continued, and outside the Virginia night pressed against the windows like it was trying to get in, and Daniel thought, one more day, just one more day, and then we'll figure out the rest. It was the same thing he'd told himself last night, and the night before that. He was starting to suspect he'd keep telling himself that for a while. He kept telling himself one more day for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Charlotte rising before dawn, and the kitchen smelling like something other than instant coffee and regret. 3 weeks of Axel's slow, reluctant recalibration. The dog no longer stiffened when she walked past, no longer tracked her every movement like she was a hostile entering a secured perimeter. He still watched her. He'd always watch her. But the quality of watching had changed, shifted from threat assessment to something closer to curiosity, the way a sentry might observe a new recruit who hadn't yet proven themselves but hadn't failed either. It was a Tuesday when Daniel came inside from fixing a section of fence along the south pasture and found Charlotte standing on a kitchen chair, reaching for something on the top shelf of the pantry. The chair was wobbling. She was on her toes, belly pressed against the shelf edge, fingers stretching for a can of tomatoes that had been shoved to the back, probably before Daniel even bought the place. "Get down," he said from the doorway. She didn't startle. That was the thing about Charlotte. She never startled. It was like she'd made some internal agreement with fear years ago, a treaty that said you can exist, but you don't get to run the show. "I almost have it." "You almost have a broken neck. Get off the chair." "Daniel?" He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, reached over her head, and grabbed the can. His chest was close to her back, close enough that he could smell whatever soap she'd been using, something clean and sharp that didn't belong in this house. And for a second, neither of them moved. Then he stepped back, set the can on the counter, and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts frustration and something he refused to examine. "You're 7 months pregnant," he said, standing on a chair with a broken leg. "The chair's leg is broken?" "Has been since I moved in." Charlotte looked down at the chair, then back at him. "You could have mentioned that. You could have asked for help." The words landed harder than he'd intended. Something flickered across her face. Not hurt, exactly, but an awareness of it, the shadow of a feeling she'd trained herself to deflect. She stepped off the chair carefully, both hands on the counter for balance, and when she turned around, her expression was neutral again, composed. That mask she wore like a second skin. "I don't ask for help," she said. "I've noticed. It's not pride, it's practice. There's a difference?" She opened the can of tomatoes without answering, and the conversation was over the way their conversations always ended. Not with resolution, but with a mutual retreat to safe territory. She cooked. He went back outside. The fence still needed 2 more posts replaced, and working with his hands was the only reliable way he knew to stop his brain from circling things it didn't know how to land on. But something had shifted in the kitchen, and they both knew it. The almost contact, the closeness, the way his hand had brushed the shelf above her head, and for one stupid, reckless moment, he'd wanted to put it on her shoulder instead. He hadn't. He wouldn't. But the wanting, that was new. That was a crack in the wall he'd been building for 3 years, and cracks, once they start, have a way of spreading. That night they sat on the porch after dinner. This had become a habit too, one of the dozen small routines that had assembled themselves around their coexistence like scaffolding around a building that was still deciding what it wanted to be. Charlotte would sit on the bench, Daniel on the top step, Axel between them. They'd watch the dark settle over the Blue Ridge foothills, and sometimes they'd talk and sometimes they wouldn't, and both versions of the evening carried the same strange, unnameable weight. "Can I ask you something?" Charlotte said. "You just said you don't ask." "I said I don't ask for help. Questions are different." He waited. "Why are you here?" she asked. "On this farm, alone. A man your age with your—" She paused, choosing words. "Your skill set. You could be anywhere." "I am somewhere." "You're hiding." "I'm living." "Those aren't mutually exclusive." Daniel looked out at the dark. A barn owl was calling from somewhere near the tree line. A sound like a rusty hinge, repetitive and lonely. Axel's ears rotated toward it, then back. "I did 2 things my whole adult life," he said, and he wasn't sure why he was saying it, except that the dark made it easier and she'd asked without pity, and he was tired of the silence being the only thing that knew the truth. "I served, and I was somebody's partner. Both of those ended within the same year. The serving ended because—" He stopped, rerouted. It just ended. And the relationship ended because I wasn't what she needed anymore. I came back different, and she wanted the version of me that left, and that version wasn't available. Discontinued model. Charlotte was quiet for a long time. The owl called again. "What was her name?" she asked. "Megan." "Did you love her?" "I thought I did. She thought I did. Turns out thinking and doing are different sports." "Were you married?" "No. Almost. We'd talked about it." He paused. "She wanted a life I couldn't give her. Normal hours. Dinner parties. Weekends at her parents' place in Richmond, sitting in a lawn chair pretending to care about college football. I tried. For about 8 months after I got out, I tried to be that person. Wore khakis, went to a farmer's market, bought a throw rug." He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. "Megan said I looked like a hostage in every photograph." "Did you?" "Probably. So you left." "I stopped pretending. There's a difference." He looked at her sideways. "You'd know something about that." Charlotte's hand moved to her belly. That unconscious gesture he'd seen 100 times now, the way she'd touched the curve like she was checking that something was still there, still real, still hers. "I would." "Your turn." "I didn't agree to terms." "You asked me a question. Fair's fair." She considered this. The porch light cast long shadows across her face, deepening the hollows under her eyes, sharpening the line of her jaw. She'd gained a little weight in 3 weeks. Not much, but enough that she looked less like someone in the process of disappearing and more like someone who'd decided to stay visible. I built a company, she said, from nothing, from a laptop and a studio apartment in Baltimore with a radiator that sounded like a dying animal. I built it into something that mattered, something real, and then I made the mistake of trusting someone who saw what I'd built and decided it should be his. The baby's father. I said, don't ask about the baby's father. You brought him up. Her jaw tightened, then relaxed. She exhaled through her nose, a sharp, controlled breath that reminded him of the way he breathed before doing something difficult. Marcus. His name is Marcus Webb. We were together for 2 years. He was charming and smart, and he told me he loved what I'd built and wanted to help me grow it. And I believed him because I wanted to believe someone could love both the thing I'd made and the person who made it. She stopped. Daniel waited. He leveraged a board coup while I was in my first trimester, restructured the voting shares while I was sick every morning and too exhausted to read the fine print on documents I shouldn't have signed. By the time I realized what was happening, I was locked out of my own company. My accounts were frozen pending litigation, and the man I thought was my partner was sitting in my office telling me I should be grateful he was offering a settlement at all. Her voice didn't shake. That was the thing that hit Daniel hardest, the steadiness of it. She was describing the demolition of her entire life, and her voice was level and clear and dry-eyed, the way you talk about a war when you've already accepted which side lost. How much? Daniel asked. How much what? The company. How much was it worth? When I left, the last valuation was $2.3 billion. The number hung in the air between them like something physical. Daniel stared at her. Billion, he repeated, with a B. And you're on my farm, eating canned tomatoes. The irony is not lost on me, Daniel. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh but didn't have enough air behind it to qualify. So you ran. I left. Strategically. My lawyers are working the litigation, but Marcus has resources and connections and a talent for making things take twice as long as they should. The frozen accounts mean I can't access my own money. The pregnancy means I can't. She stopped again. When she continued, her voice was quieter. I couldn't stay in a city where everyone knew my name and no one knew the truth. I couldn't sit in a rented apartment watching my body change and my life unravel at the same time. So I drove. I picked a direction and I drove until the truck died and I ended up here. On a 62-acre farm with a broken porch and a man who hasn't had a conversation this long in 3 years. Life's funny that way. Funny's not the word I'd use. She turned to look at him. In the half-light, her eyes were dark and steady and full of something that wasn't tears but was close, the pressure behind a dam that hadn't broken yet but knew it could. I'm going to get it back, she said. All of it, the company, the money, my name. I'm going to get it back and I'm going to make sure Marcus Webb understands what it costs to take something from someone who built it with her bare hands. Daniel believed her. He didn't know why. Maybe because of the way she said it, without heat or bravado, just a flat, absolute certainty that sounded less like a promise and more like a weather forecast. Something inevitable. But first, she added, and her hand moved across her belly again, I have to do this. I have to have this baby somewhere safe, somewhere no one's watching, somewhere I can figure out how to be a mother before I figure out how to be a CEO again. And you think this is that place? I think this is the only place that didn't ask me to be anything. The owl had gone quiet. Axel shifted between them, his weight pressing against Daniel's knee. The night was cold and clear, and the stars above the Blue Ridge were scattered like broken glass, sharp and bright, and indifferent to whatever was happening on this porch. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. Wasn't the barren, echoless silence of a man alone with his dog on a dying farm. It was full, heavy with shared truth and mutual understanding and the particular kind of intimacy that comes not from what people say to each other, but from what they choose to reveal. Charlotte stood slowly, one hand on the porch railing. Thank you for dinner. You made dinner. Thank you for sitting here. She went inside. The screen door closed softly behind her. Her footsteps moved through the living room, up the stairs, down the hall, then the creak of her bedroom door. then quiet. Daniel sat on the porch step for a long time after that. Axel didn't move from his spot. The dog's body was warm against Daniel's leg, a steady, living weight that grounded him the way it always did when his thoughts started drifting toward places he couldn't control. $2.3 billion. The woman sleeping upstairs in his broken-down farmhouse had built something worth $2.3 billion and had lost it to a man who'd smiled while he stole it and called it business. And she was here, cleaning his kitchen, organizing his pantry, putting flowers in a mason jar on his table. Daniel ran a hand over Axel's head. The dog's eyes closed halfway, then opened again. Never fully relaxed, never fully off duty. "We're in trouble, buddy," Daniel murmured. Axel's tail swept the porch once. Agreement. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Daniel's life, and that was saying something for a man who'd spent a decade in places where strange was the baseline and normal was a rumor. Charlotte had taken over the kitchen entirely, and he'd surrendered it without a fight, partly because her cooking was better than anything he'd ever made, and partly because watching her move through that space with confidence and purpose did something to the atmosphere of the house that he couldn't replicate with 20 years of effort. She cooked the way she did everything, methodically, intensely, with no wasted motion and no patience for shortcuts. She'd found a farmer's market in the town 8 miles south and had convinced him to drive her there on his weekly supply run. He'd sat in the truck while she spent 45 minutes selecting vegetables with the seriousness of a surgeon choosing instruments. "These carrots are perfect," she'd said, holding up a bunch like they were a trophy. "They're carrots. They're perfect carrots. There's a difference." She cooked things he hadn't eaten in years. Roasted chicken with herbs she'd grown from clippings in mason jars on the kitchen windowsill. A beef stew that simmered for 6 hours and filled the house with a smell that made Daniel's chest hurt for reasons he couldn't articulate. Cornbread from scratch, because she'd found his cast iron skillet and declared it the only good thing in this kitchen. "The stove works," he'd said, mildly offended. "The stove works like a man who shows up to a job he hates, technically present, barely functional." She was funny. That was the thing nobody warned him about. Under the composure and the steel and the careful control, Charlotte Vance was funny in a way that caught you off guard. Dry, quiet, precise. The kind of humor that didn't announce itself but landed like a delayed fuse, hitting you 3 seconds after she'd already moved on. And the house responded. That was the part Daniel couldn't rationalize. The house itself seemed to shift around her presence, the way a body shifts around a healing wound, carefully, tentatively, as if testing whether it was safe to move normally again. Doors that had stuck for years began opening smoothly because Charlotte had sanded the edges and rubbed them with soap. The second-floor hallway, which had been dark and narrow and vaguely oppressive, now had light coming in from a window she'd cleaned and curtains she'd washed and rehung. The living room had books on the shelves instead of stacked on the floor. The wood stove burned cleaner because she'd figured out the damper adjustment that Daniel had never bothered learning. It was like watching someone breathe life into a corpse. Slow, steady, one breath at a time. And Axel, who trusted nothing and no one, who had bitten a professional handler and been labeled unfit for civilian life, Axel was changing. It started small. A shifted position, a relaxed jaw, an ear that swiveled toward Charlotte when she spoke but didn't flatten in warning. Then it got bigger. She was in the kitchen one evening chopping onions when Daniel heard something he hadn't heard in the 3 years he'd owned the dog. A whine, low, brief, directed at Charlotte. Daniel came to the kitchen doorway and saw Axel sitting 3 feet from Charlotte's legs, nose up, watching her chop onions with an expression that was, against all evidence and reason, hopeful. "He's begging," Daniel said, disbelief flattening his voice. Charlotte looked down at the dog, then at Daniel. "Is that unusual?" "He's never begged for anything in his life. I've had to put his food bowl down and walk away for him to eat. He doesn't beg." "Maybe he likes onions." "Nobody likes onions." Charlotte bent, slowly, carefully, one hand on the counter, and held her hand out toward Axel, palm up, fingers loose. Not reaching for him, offering, letting him decide. The dog's nostrils flared. He leaned forward, closed the distance by an inch, then another. His nose touched her fingertips. A brief electric contact, and then he pulled back, stood, and walked to his bed by the stove with the exaggerated dignity of a creature who was absolutely not embarrassed about what had just happened. Charlotte straightened and went back to her onions without comment. But Daniel saw it. The moment of contact, the trust it represented from a dog who'd been conditioned by violence and training and lost to never offer trust freely. Axel had touched her hand, had chosen to bridge that gap. And something about watching it happen, watching this broken, brilliant, pregnant woman standing barefoot in his kitchen, being accepted by a dog who accepted no one, made the crack in Daniel's wall spread another inch. He turned and walked back to the living room before she could see his face. The problem with cracks, he was learning, was that you couldn't seal them by pretending they weren't there. You could ignore them, you could work around them, you could tell yourself that the wall was still solid and the structure was still sound. But the crack knew the truth. And the truth was that Daniel Brooks was no longer living alone on a 62-acre farm with his dog. He was living with someone, building a rhythm with someone, eating meals across from someone whose laugh, when it occasionally escaped, brief and startled, like a bird flushed from a hedge, made his lungs forget what they were doing. He didn't act on it. He wouldn't act on it. She was pregnant, she was vulnerable, she was in the middle of a legal war with a man who'd stripped her of everything she'd built. And the last thing she needed was a broken former seal with a noise-reactive startle response making things complicated. But he thought about it. Late at night, lying in bed, listening to the house settle and the wind push against the windows and Charlotte's footsteps in the hall when she got up to use the bathroom. 3, 4 times a night now, the baby pressing on everything. He thought about what it would be like to not be alone anymore. Not hypothetically. Not in the abstract way he sometimes wondered, the way you wonder about weather patterns in countries you'll never visit. Specifically, concretely. What would it be like to walk into the kitchen in the morning and have her already there, and for that to be normal, and for that normalcy to not feel like a threat? He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure he wanted one. But the wall kept cracking, and Charlotte kept cooking, and Axel kept inching closer, and the farm kept breathing in a way it hadn't breathed in years. Then the phone rang. Daniel's cell phone sat on the kitchen counter in the same spot it had occupied for 3 years. Plugged in, charged, silent. He kept it for emergencies. The only people who had the number were the county tax office and a VA administrator in Richmond who called once a year to remind him about benefits he'd never claimed. Nobody else. He'd made sure of that. So when it rang on a Wednesday morning at 7:14 a.m., vibrating against the counter with an incoming call from a number he hadn't seen in over 2 years, Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway and felt something cold slide through his chest like a blade. Charlotte was at the table, eating toast. She looked at the phone, then at him. "You going to answer that?" He didn't move. The phone kept ringing. 6 rings. 7. Then it stopped. The screen went dark. Silence. "Daniel?" "It's nothing." "Your face says it's something." He crossed the kitchen, picked up the phone, and stared at the missed call notification. The number was a 757 area code, Virginia Beach. He knew who it was before he checked, the way you know the sound of a door you've been dreading hearing open. Megan. The phone buzzed in his hand, a text message. He read it standing at the counter, his back to Charlotte, his shoulders tight enough to ache. "I know you won't answer, that's fine, but I need to talk to you. I'm coming to the farm." "Don't argue. I already have the address. I'll be there Friday. Please don't shut me out again. M." Daniel set the phone down. He placed both hands on the counter's edge and leaned forward, letting his weight settle through his arms, breathing the way he'd been taught to breathe in situations where the body wanted to fight and the brain needed to think. "Daniel," Charlotte said again. Her voice was careful now, the voice of someone who recognized danger not by its volume, but by its silence. "My ex," he said. "She's coming here. Friday. A beat." "Here? To the farm?" "That's what she said." "How does she know where you are?" "I don't know. County records. The deed is public." He pushed off the counter and turned around. Charlotte was watching him from the table, toast forgotten, one hand resting on her belly. Axel was at his feet, pressing against his leg, reading the tension in his body with the accuracy of a seismograph. "Do you want her to come?" Charlotte asked. The question was simple. The answer wasn't. It doesn't matter what I want. She's coming. It matters, Daniel. It matters a lot. He looked at her. This woman who'd arrived on his doorstep 5 weeks ago with nothing but bad boots and a baby and a refusal to break. And he wanted to say something honest, something that matched the honesty she'd given him that night on the porch, when she'd told him about Marcus and the company and the life that had been taken from her in broad daylight. He wanted to tell her that the sound of Megan's name in his chest felt like a grenade with the pin pulled, that he'd spent 3 years building a silence specifically designed to keep this exact moment from happening, that the farm and the fence and the perimeter checks and the locked doors were all part of the same architecture, a structure built to withstand the one thing he couldn't survive again, someone coming back and asking him to be something he'd already proven he couldn't be. But he didn't say any of that, because the words were too big and the kitchen was too small, and Charlotte was watching him with those dark, steady eyes, and he was afraid, genuinely afraid, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that if he opened his mouth, what came out wouldn't be words at all. "I need to fix the south fence," he said. "The posts are rotting." He walked past her, out the back door, across the yard, and into the cold morning air. Axel followed, silent and close, pressing against his left leg the way he always did when Daniel's breathing changed and his hands started shaking and the world got loud inside his head. Behind them, Charlotte sat alone at the kitchen table, one hand on her belly, watching through the window as Daniel Brooks walked away from the only conversation that mattered. The way, she was beginning to understand, he always did. Friday came the way bad weather comes. You see it building on the horizon. You track its approach. You tell yourself you're ready, and then it arrives and you realize you weren't ready at all. Daniel spent Thursday doing things that didn't need doing. He replaced fence posts that were fine. He cleaned the barn gutters, which he'd never cleaned before and had no practical reason to clean now. He sharpened every tool in the shed, reorganized the woodpile Charlotte had already organized, and walked the perimeter twice, once in the morning, once at dusk, with Axel moving beside him in that tight, alert gait that meant the dog was mirroring his handler's anxiety and didn't like what it was telling him. Charlotte watched all of this from a distance. She didn't comment. She didn't ask. She cooked. She cleaned. She moved through the house with the same steady efficiency she'd brought since her first morning, but there was something more careful in her movements now, a deliberate lightness, like she was trying to take up less space in anticipation of a house that was about to get crowded. They ate dinner Thursday night without speaking. Not the comfortable silence they'd built over 5 weeks. This was different. This was the silence of two people sitting in a room where a third person's ghost had already arrived. Daniel pushed his plate away half-finished. "She's going to have questions." Charlotte looked up. "About me. About everything. About why I'm here, what I've been doing for 3 years. Why I haven't—" He stopped. "Haven't what?" "Come back. Tried again. Done the thing normal people do after a breakup, which is apparently join a gym and download an app and pretend you're fine until you actually are." "Is that what normal people do?" "I have no idea. I haven't been normal in a long time." Charlotte set her fork down. "Do you want me to leave before she gets here?" The question hit him like cold water. Not because it was unexpected. It was, in fact, the most logical thing she could have said, but because of how immediately and viscerally his body rejected it. His jaw tightened, his hands, resting on the table, curled slightly. Axel, under the table, pressed harder against his leg. "No," Daniel said. Too fast. Too definite. He heard it and tried to soften it. "This is your home too, for now. You don't leave because someone else is showing up." Charlotte studied him with that look she had, the one that saw through the surface of what people said and read the architecture underneath. "Okay," she said, "then I'll be here." "You don't have to. You don't have to be around for it. You can stay upstairs, or—" "Daniel, I'll be here." He nodded. Something loosened in his chest, just slightly. Not enough to breathe freely, but enough to breathe. The car pulled up the driveway at 11:47 a.m. on Friday. Daniel knew the exact time because he'd been standing at the kitchen window since 10 o'clock, drinking coffee he wasn't tasting, watching the dirt road like a man watching a fuse burn down. It was a white Audi SUV. Clean, polished, aggressively out of place on a dirt road in the Blue Ridge foothills. The kind of car that belonged in a suburban driveway next to a house with a two-car garage and a lawn service. It rolled to a stop behind Daniel's truck, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The engine idled. The driver sat behind tinted glass. Then the door opened, and Megan Harper stepped out. She looked exactly the same. That was the first thing Daniel registered, and it hit him harder than he'd anticipated. The familiarity of her, the specific way she moved, the tilt of her head when she was uncertain about something. She was 31, tall, auburn hair cut shorter than he remembered, wearing jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than everything in his closet combined. She stood by the car and looked at the farm with an expression that cycled through several emotions in quick succession: shock, pity, confusion, and something else that Daniel recognized because he'd seen it on her face 100 times before: the particular sadness of someone who loved a person they couldn't understand. Axel hit the front door before Daniel could stop him. Not physically, the door was closed, but the barking started, deep and sustained and furious. The full alert bark of a military working dog who'd identified an unknown and was waiting for instructions. The sound filled the house, bounced off the walls, shook the windows in their frames. "Axel," Daniel said. "Ruhig." The barking dropped to a growl, low, continuous, an engine on idle. Daniel opened the front door. Megan was still by the car, one hand on the door like she was calculating whether to get back in. Her eyes went to Axel first. The dog was on the porch, hackles raised, every muscle visible under his coat. And then to Daniel, and he watched her face do the thing it always did when she saw him after time apart. A quick inventory, checking for damage, looking for the parts that had changed and the parts that hadn't. "You got a dog," she said. "He's not new. He's terrifying. He's doing his job." Daniel put his hand on Axel's collar, not restraining, just touching, a signal that said, "I'm aware, stand down." The growl faded to a vibration Daniel could feel through his fingers. Megan walked up the driveway slowly, her eyes moving across the property the way they'd moved across Daniel, cataloging, assessing, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with whatever she'd imagined. The peeling paint, the sagging porch, the barn listing like a drunk leaning against a wall. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at him. "You look thin," she said. "You look the same." "Daniel, She stopped, took a breath, started again. "I know you don't want me here. I know this is the last thing you—" "Then why are you here, Megan?" The directness of it made her flinch. She'd never liked his directness. She called it bluntness, which was the same thing but dressed in disapproval. "Because it's been 3 years. Because you disappeared. Because your mother called me. Yes, she still has my number. And asked if I'd heard from you, and I had to tell her no, and the sound she made on the phone—" Megan's voice cracked. Just barely. She caught it, swallowed it back. "You're not the only person who got hurt when you left, Daniel. You just decided you were the only one who mattered." The words were precise and sharp, and aimed with the accuracy of someone who'd had 3 years to think about what she'd say when she finally said it. Daniel felt them land, felt each one like a small controlled detonation in the center of his chest, and he stood on the porch and let them hit because she wasn't wrong. She wasn't entirely right either, but she wasn't wrong. "Come inside," he said. She climbed the porch steps. Axel tracked every movement, his body rigid, his nose working. When she reached the top step, the dog shifted to position himself between Megan and the door. A deliberate block, a checkpoint. "Axel," Daniel said. "Platz." The dog lay down, but his eyes never left Megan, and the message was clear. "I'm complying because he asked, not because I agree." They went inside. Megan stopped in the living room and looked around, and Daniel watched her register the changes: the clean floors, the organized shelves, the throw pillows on the couch, the curtains that hung straight. Her eyes caught the mason jar with dried flowers on the kitchen table, and something shifted in her expression. A question formed and dissolved before it reached her mouth. Then Charlotte walked down the stairs. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Daniel had ever heard. 3 people in a living room, nobody speaking, the air between them thick with implications that were assembling themselves faster than anyone could control. Charlotte stopped on the bottom stair. She was wearing one of Daniel's flannel shirts. She'd borrowed it weeks ago when the temperature dropped and her jacket wasn't warm enough for indoors. And her belly was visible underneath, round and undeniable. Megan's eyes went from Charlotte to Daniel, then back to Charlotte, then to Daniel again. Her face did something complicated, a rapid sequence of calculations, conclusions, and emotions that arrived stacked on top of each other like a pileup on a highway. "You have got to be kidding me," Megan said. "It's not what you think." "Really? Because what I think is that you spent 3 years telling me you needed to be alone, that you couldn't be in a relationship, that you weren't capable of—" She gestured at the room, at the flowers, at Charlotte, at the entire domestic scene that contradicted every word Daniel had ever said about himself. "This. And apparently what you meant was you couldn't do this with me." "Megan, how far along is she?" "That's not— How far along?" Charlotte's voice came from the stairs, calm and level. "Almost 8 months, and it's not his." Megan turned to her. The two women looked at each other across the living room, the ex-partner and the stranger, the woman who'd left and the woman who'd arrived, and Daniel stood between them feeling like a man caught in a crossfire he'd built himself. "I'm Charlotte," Charlotte said. "I'm staying here temporarily. Daniel offered me a room when I had nowhere else to go. There's nothing between us." The words were factual, reasonable, delivered with the same composure Charlotte brought to everything, and they were, in the strictest technical sense, true. There was nothing between them, nothing declared, nothing acted on, nothing that existed in any form other than the crack in Daniel's wall and the way she laughed sometimes, and the fact that he'd stopped counting days and started counting the meals they shared. Megan looked at Daniel. "Is that true?" "Yes." "You're housing a pregnant stranger out of the goodness of your heart." "I'm letting someone work in exchange for a room. It's not charity." "Daniel, you don't let people in. That was the whole thing. That was the entire reason we—" She stopped, pressed her fingers to her temples, took a breath. Okay, I didn't come here to fight about this. I came because— Because what?" "Because I still care about you." The words came out raw and unprotected, stripped of the polish she'd walked in with. "Because 3 years is a long time to wonder if someone you loved is alive or dead. And I got tired of wondering, because I thought, stupidly, apparently, that maybe enough time had passed for us to have an honest conversation about what happened. What happened is I left. What happened is you shut down. You came back from your last deployment and you were a different person. And I tried to reach you, and you pulled away. And I tried harder, and you pulled further, and eventually you were so far away that leaving was just a formality. The geography caught up to the emotional distance. Daniel's hands were shaking. He shoved them into his pockets. Axel was on his feet now, positioned at Daniel's side, pressing against his left leg with steady pressure. A grounding technique the dog had developed on his own, something no trainer had taught him. "You're right," Daniel said, and the admission cost him something visible. A tightening around his eyes, a shift in his posture, the particular kind of surrender that comes from agreeing with an accusation you've spent years trying to outrun. "You're right about all of it. I shut down. I couldn't be what you needed. And instead of being honest about that, I disappeared. That wasn't fair to you." Megan's eyes filled. She blinked rapidly, fighting it. "I didn't come here for an apology." "Then what did you come for?" "I came to ask you to try again." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, ripples everywhere. Charlotte's hand went to the stair railing. Axel's ears flattened. Daniel's whole body went rigid, a combat response to an emotional detonation, every muscle locked. "Megan, I know how it sounds. I know. But I've spent 3 years dating people who aren't you and comparing everyone to someone who didn't even want to be compared. I went to therapy. I did the work. And what I figured out is that the person I was with, the person you were before you left, he's still in there somewhere, underneath all of this." She gestured at the farm, the house, the isolation. "Underneath the walls and the silence, and the dog who won't let anyone within 10 feet. You're still in there, Daniel, and I want to find you." Charlotte moved first. Quietly, without drawing attention, she turned and walked back up the stairs. Daniel heard her footsteps on the landing, heard her bedroom door close, softly, carefully, the way she did everything. She was removing herself from a scene she had no place in, and the precision of her exit, the dignity of it, made Daniel's chest ache in a way he couldn't attribute to Megan's words alone. "Say something," Megan said. "I'm not the same person." "I know that." "No, you don't. You think I'm hiding. You think this is a phase, some kind of extended breakdown that I'll snap out of if the right person says the right thing. But this is who I am now, this farm, this silence, this life. I didn't end up here by accident. I chose it. Every day I choose it. You chose to be alone. I chose to stop pretending I was someone I'm not. And who are you, Daniel? Who are you now?" He didn't have an answer. 6 weeks ago, he would have. 6 weeks ago, he'd have said, "I'm a man who lives alone on a farm with a dog, and that's enough." But 6 weeks ago, there hadn't been flowers on the kitchen table and laughter in the hallway, and a woman who made his kitchen smell like a place where people actually lived. "I don't know," he said, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in 3 years. Megan stayed for 2 hours. They sat on the porch, the same porch where Daniel and Charlotte sat most evenings, which felt like a violation of something sacred, though Daniel couldn't have explained why. And they talked in the cautious, circular way of people who are trying to have a conversation while tiptoeing around landmines they planted themselves years ago. She told him about her life, a new job in marketing at a tech firm in Norfolk, a condo she'd bought near the waterfront, friends who asked about him less often now, which she said was a relief and clearly wasn't. She told him about his mother, still in Wheeling, still working at the diner, still calling Megan every few months to ask if she'd heard anything. "You should call her," Megan said. "I know. Knowing and doing, Daniel." "Yeah, I've heard that one before." She left at 2 o'clock. Standing by her car, she looked at him one more time with those green eyes that used to make him feel seen and now made him feel pinned. "I'm not giving up on you," she said. "Megan, I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm asking you to think about it. About whether the life you're building here, alone, with your dog and your fence posts and your silence, is really what you want. Or whether it's just the easiest thing to keep choosing, because choosing something harder means risking getting hurt again." She got in the car. The Audi backed down the driveway, turned onto the dirt road, and disappeared behind the tree line. Daniel stood in the yard until the sound of the engine faded to nothing, until the silence came back and settled over the farm like a blanket being pulled over a body. Axel was beside him. The dog sat down, leaned against his leg, and looked up at him with eyes that were ancient and amber and completely without judgment. "Don't say it," Daniel muttered. Axel blinked. Daniel went inside. The house was quiet. Charlotte's door was closed. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. Nothing. No movement, no sound, no indication that anyone was behind that door at all. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window. He looked at the mason jar with the dried flowers and the second chair at the table and the curtains that hung straight and the kitchen that smelled like rosemary because Charlotte had been making something when Megan arrived and had left it half finished on the counter. He should go upstairs. He should knock on her door and tell her, what, that Megan was gone? She knew that nothing had changed, something had, that he wasn't going back to Megan. He didn't know that yet, and lying to Charlotte felt worse than lying to himself. An hour passed, then 2. The afternoon light shifted, grew long and golden, then started to fade. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and didn't move, and Axel sat at his feet and didn't move. And upstairs, Charlotte stayed in her room, and the house held all 3 of them in separate silences that were heavier than any sound. At 6 o'clock, he heard her door open. Footsteps in the hallway. The stairs. She appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing a different shirt. Her own, not his. And her hair was down, loose around her shoulders, and her eyes were red-rimmed in a way she'd clearly tried to hide and hadn't entirely succeeded. She'd been crying. Charlotte, who didn't cry, who hadn't cried when she told him about Marcus, who hadn't cried when she described losing a $2 billion company, who hadn't cried in 5 weeks of sleeping in a stranger's house with nothing to her name but a broken-down truck and a baby she hadn't met yet. She'd been crying because of this. "I was going to make dinner," she said, and her voice was level, controlled, normal, as if the red eyes were an illusion, a trick of the light. Something that could be ignored if both parties agreed to ignore it. "But you're out of onions." I can drive to town. It's fine. I'll figure something out. She crossed to the counter and started pulling things from the pantry. Canned beans, rice, the spice jars she'd arranged in alphabetical order her first week. Charlotte. I didn't ask her to come. I know. And I'm not... He stopped. What was he going to say? I'm not going back to her? I'm not leaving. I'm not the man she thinks I am, but I'm not sure I'm the man you think I am either. Charlotte turned around. She leaned against the counter, both hands braced behind her, belly prominent under her shirt, and she looked at him with an expression that broke something open inside his chest. Not because it was angry or hurt or accusatory, but because it was kind. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly kind. The kindness of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided, despite every reason not to be generous about it. Daniel, she said, you don't owe me an explanation. We have an arrangement. I work, you provide shelter. Whatever's happening between you and your ex is your business. I'm not... She swallowed. The composure wavered, just for a second, like a candle flame in a draft. I'm not part of that equation. You are, though. The words were out before he could stop them. They hung in the kitchen air between them, honest and terrifying and irreversible. Charlotte stared at him. He stared back. Axel looked between them with the expression of a creature who understood the emotional dynamics of a situation better than either human involved. Don't, Charlotte said softly. Don't say that unless you mean something by it. I don't know what I mean. Then don't say it. She turned back to the counter. Her hands moved, opening a can, measuring rice, filling a pot with water, steady and deliberate and shaking, just slightly at the edges. She was shaking. Charlotte Vance, who never shook, who never cracked, who never let the seams show. She was standing at his kitchen counter making rice and beans, and her hands were trembling. Daniel stood up from the table. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped behind her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could feel him there, the way you feel a storm approaching before you see it. I don't know what I mean yet, he said, but I know what I don't mean. I don't mean nothing. Charlotte's hands stopped moving. She didn't turn around. She stood there, facing the counter, her back to him, her shoulders rising and falling with breaths that were deeper than they needed to be. Okay, she whispered. Okay? Okay. That's enough for now. She went back to cooking. He went back to the table. Axel settled between them, chin on paws, eyes half closed, the guardian of a peace that was fragile and temporary, and more important than either of them knew. They ate dinner without speaking about any of it. They sat on the porch afterward, in their usual spots, and watched the stars appear over the blue ridge, like someone was punching holes in a dark sheet. The owl was back, calling from the tree line. Axel lay between them, closer to Charlotte than he'd ever positioned himself before, close enough that his tail touched her ankle when it swept the floor. She didn't mention it. Daniel did. He's never done that before, he said. With anyone. Charlotte looked down at the dog, then at Daniel. And for the first time since Megan's visit, something warm moved through her eyes. Brief, guarded, wrapped in layers of protection, but there. Visible. Real. Maybe he's learning, she said. Maybe. They sat in the dark, listening to the owl and the wind and the slow creak of a farmhouse that was holding itself together through stubbornness alone. And neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was that learning was dangerous and change was painful, and the hardest part of building something new was accepting that it could be taken away. The week after Megan's visit passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Not the comfortable silence they'd built together over the previous weeks, and not the tense silence of the days before her arrival. This was something else. A holding pattern. Two people orbiting each other in a small farmhouse, close enough to touch, careful enough not to, both aware that something had been said in a kitchen that couldn't be unsaid, and neither of them ready to say what came next. Charlotte threw herself into work with an intensity that bordered on punishing. She reorganized the pantry for the second time. She scrubbed the bathroom tile until the grout was white again. She found a sewing kit in one of the back bedroom boxes, and repaired the tear in the living room curtain that Daniel had been ignoring for 2 years. She moved through the house like a woman trying to outrun her own thoughts. And Daniel recognized the strategy because it was exactly what he did with fence posts and firewood and perimeter checks. The ancient, desperate math of keeping your hands busy so your brain couldn't do damage. He watched her. He couldn't stop watching her. Not in the way he'd watched her at the beginning. The cautious observation of a man who'd let a stranger into his home and was waiting for the catch. This was different. He watched the way she pressed her hand against the small of her back when she thought no one was looking, the way she talked to the baby in whispers when she was alone in the kitchen, the way she'd stand at the window sometimes and look out at the hills with an expression that was equal parts longing and resolve, like she was homesick for a version of her life that didn't exist yet. He called his mother on Tuesday. He didn't tell Charlotte. He didn't tell anyone. He just picked up the phone at 6 a.m. while the house was still dark and Charlotte was still asleep, and Axel was watching him from the kitchen floor with those amber eyes that missed nothing, and he dialed the number he'd memorized 20 years ago and never deleted. She answered on the second ring. "Danny?" The sound of her voice, older, thinner, but unmistakably hers, hit him somewhere behind the ribs, in a place he'd boarded up so long ago he'd forgotten there was a room behind the wall. "Hey, Mom." Silence. Then a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. Then, 3 years, Daniel Wayne Brooks. I thought you were dead. I called the VA. I called the Navy. I called Megan, poor Megan, calling her every few months like some crazy woman, asking if she'd heard from my own son. I know. I'm sorry. You're sorry. He's sorry. She was crying now, openly, the way his mother had always cried, loud and unashamed and with a kind of furious tenderness that made you feel simultaneously forgiven and condemned. "Where are you? Are you eating? Are you hurt?" "I'm in Virginia. I'm fine. I'm eating." "You bought a farm." Megan told me. She said it looks like something out of a horror movie. It's not that bad. "Daniel, it needs work. It needs condemning." He almost laughed. Almost. The sound got as far as his throat and stopped, blocked by something thick and hot that he refused to name. "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't call. I'm sorry I—" His voice broke. Just barely, just at the edges, a hairline fracture in the composure he'd maintained for 32 years. He pressed his fist against the counter and breathed. "I wasn't in a place where I could talk to anyone. I needed to be gone for a while. A while is 6 months, a while is a year. 3 years without a word. That's not a while, Danny. That's an amputation." She was right. He knew she was right. The guilt of it sat in his stomach like a stone. Not because he regretted the isolation, but because the isolation had required casualties, and his mother had been one of them, and he'd let that happen because confronting it would have meant confronting everything else. They talked for 40 minutes. He told her about the farm, the real version, not the cleaned-up version Megan had probably relayed. He told her about Axel. He did not tell her about Charlotte. He wasn't sure why. Some instinct, some protective reflex that said this thing, whatever it was, wasn't ready to be named out loud to anyone else yet. When he hung up, his hands were shaking and his coffee was cold, and Axel was pressing against his leg with the steady, warm pressure that said, "I'm here. I know. It's done." Charlotte appeared in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later, hair messy from sleep, one hand on her belly. She looked at him, and he knew she could see it. The rawness, the aftermath of an emotional excavation he hadn't been prepared for. She could always see it. That was the problem and the miracle of Charlotte Vance. She saw everything, and she chose what to acknowledge and what to leave alone with a precision that felt less like tact and more like grace. "You okay?" she asked. "Called my mom." "How'd that go?" "She cried, then she yelled at me, then she cried again." "Sounds about right." Charlotte crossed to the stove and put the kettle on. She'd bought herbal tea on their last trip to the farmer's market, peppermint and chamomile, and the smell of it had become part of the morning the way her footsteps on the stairs had become part of the morning, woven into the fabric of his days so completely that pulling it out would leave a hole. "She wants to visit," Daniel said. "Your mother?" "I told her not yet." Charlotte poured hot water over a tea bag and brought the mug to the table. She sat down in her chair. Her chair, the second chair, the one he'd brought in from the porch 8 weeks ago that was now permanently hers, and wrapped both hands around the mug. Daniel, can I say something honest? When have you not? You can't keep everyone at arm's length forever. Your mother, Megan, whoever else is out there wondering if you're alive, at some point the arm gets tired. Is that what happened to you? Your arm got tired? She looked at him over the rim of her mug. My arm broke. That's different. He sat down across from her. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, the window she'd cleaned her first week, the one that actually let in light now. And it caught her face at an angle that made her look both younger and more worn than she was, like a photograph that had been handled too many times. Megan wants to try again, he said. I know. You were upstairs. Walls in this house are thin, Daniel, and she wasn't exactly whispering. He ran a hand over his jaw. He needed to shave. He needed to do a lot of things. I don't know what to do about it. Do you still love her? I don't know if I ever did. Not the right way. I loved who I was when I was with her. The functional version. The guy who could fake normal for 8 hours at a time. But that's not the same thing as loving a person. That's loving a mirror. That's the most self-aware thing you've ever said. Don't get used to it, Charlotte smiled. Not the almost smile, not the flickering half expression he'd been tracking for weeks like a meteorologist tracking a weather pattern. An actual smile. Brief, imperfect, slightly lopsided because the right side of her mouth always moved before the left, and it hit Daniel like a physical force, chest first, then outward, a shockwave of warmth he had no defenses against. He looked away. She sipped her tea. Axel sighed under the table. They let the moment exist without trying to define it, and for once, that felt like enough. 10 days later, the black SUV came. It was a Saturday, late morning. Daniel was in the barn he'd finally started repairing, motivated by some impulse he didn't want to examine too closely, some feeling that the farm should look like a place worth staying at. He'd replaced the broken support beam, straightened the door that had been hanging off its hinges for years, and was measuring plywood for the missing section of roof when Axel's head snapped up. The dog had been lying in a patch of sun near the barn entrance, half dozing in the way he did when he was relaxed enough to let one layer of vigilance go. But the snap was instantaneous. Ears forward, body rigid, nose up, the full activation of a nervous system designed for exactly this kind of transition. From rest to alert in under a second. Daniel stopped measuring. He listened. Engine. Coming up the dirt road. Not a truck. The sound was wrong. Too smooth, too heavy. Something with a bigger engine. Something expensive. He set the plywood down and walked to the barn door. Axel was already moving, trotting toward the driveway with his head low and his hackles beginning to rise in a slow wave from shoulders to tail. The SUV crested the hill and stopped. Black. Tinted windows, rental plates. The kind of vehicle that was designed to look authoritative without being specific. Not police, not military, not any particular agency. Just money. Power. The assumption that both would be sufficient. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, taller than Daniel, which didn't happen often, with the build of someone who'd been athletic once and had since traded the gym for business dinners. Mid-30s. Dark suit that was wrong for a farm in Virginia, leather shoes that were already picking up dust from the driveway. His face was handsome in a manufactured way, all sharp angles and grooming that spoke of regular maintenance. The kind of face that looked good on a corporate headshot and empty in person. Daniel knew who he was before the man opened his mouth. I'm looking for Charlotte Vance, the man said. His voice was steady, controlled, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. I have reason to believe she's here. Daniel didn't respond. He stood at the barn door with his hands at his sides and let the silence do the work. A technique he'd learned in interrogation training, though the application here was different. You don't fill silence. You let the other person fill it for you. The man waited. Then, when the silence became uncomfortable, it always became uncomfortable faster for the person who had something to prove, he took a step forward. My name is Marcus Webb. Charlotte and I know who you are. Marcus stopped, recalculated. His eyes moved across Daniel the way a predator's eyes move across an obstacle, assessing not for threat, but for inconvenience. How quickly can I get around this? Then you know I have a legitimate reason to be here. Charlotte is carrying my child. She left without notice, without communication, and my lawyers have been trying to reach her for months. I'm here to talk to her. No. The word was flat, unadorned, delivered without emphasis or aggression. Just a fact. The sky is blue. Water is wet. No. Marcus's expression shifted. The corporate composure cracked, just slightly, enough to reveal something underneath that was harder and less polished. Irritation, maybe. Or the particular kind of anger that belongs to people who aren't used to hearing that word. I don't think you understand the situation, Marcus said. I have legal rights regarding that child. Charlotte left our shared residence, abandoned her position at the company, and disappeared. I've been patient. My attorneys have been patient, but patience has limits. Axel had positioned himself 4 feet in front of Daniel, directly in the path between Marcus and the house. The dog wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He was doing something worse. Standing in absolute stillness, every muscle locked, every sense trained on the man in the suit with an intensity that was more unsettling than any sound, because it communicated something. Sounds couldn't. I am waiting for a reason. Here's what I understand, Daniel said, and his voice was quiet in the way that quiet becomes loud when the person speaking it has spent 12 years in environments where volume was a liability. You drove onto private property without invitation. You're standing in my driveway asking to see a person who clearly doesn't want to see you. And you're talking about legal rights to a man who doesn't have a lawyer, doesn't want a lawyer, and doesn't care about whatever paperwork you've got in that car. This isn't about you. It is now. Marcus took another step forward. Axel's lips drew back. Not a snarl. Something quieter. Something that showed teeth without making a sound. The canine equivalent of a weapon being drawn but not fired. Marcus stopped. For the first time, something like genuine uncertainty crossed his face. He looked at the dog. He looked at Daniel. He looked at the farmhouse behind them, where, though he couldn't see her, Charlotte was standing at the upstairs window, watching, both hands pressed against the glass, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was afraid the baby could feel it. I just want to talk to her, Marcus said, and his voice had changed, softer now, smoother, the tone of someone switching tactics. Reasonable. Calm. The voice of a man who was very good at getting what he wanted because he understood that aggression was a blunt instrument and persuasion was a scalpel. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. She won't return my calls. She won't answer my lawyer's letters. I need to know that she's safe, that the baby is safe. They're safe. I'd like to hear that from her. You're hearing it from me. And who are you exactly? Marcus took one more step. His voice was still calm, still reasonable, but there was something underneath now. A current, a charge. The electrical hum of a man whose patience was real but finite. Because from where I'm standing, you look like a guy living alone on a farm that's falling apart, and I'm trying to understand why Charlotte Vance, a woman who built a multi-billion-dollar company, is hiding out here instead of dealing with her responsibilities. Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not anger. He'd trained the anger out years ago, replaced it with something colder and more functional. This was clarity. The sharp, clean clarity that used to arrive in operational moments, when the noise fell away and the world reduced itself to geometry, angles, distances, threat vectors, the physics of force and consequence. I'm going to say this once, Daniel said, and I need you to hear every word because I'm not going to repeat it. Charlotte is here because she chose to be here. She's safe because I'm making sure she's safe. The baby is healthy and cared for and none of your concern until a court says otherwise. You're going to get in your car, drive back down that road, and communicate through lawyers like a civilized person. You're not going to come back to this farm. You're not going to send anyone to this farm. If I see that car on this road again, or any car I don't recognize, I will consider it a threat to the people living under this roof, and I will respond accordingly. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against the eardrums and compresses the air. Marcus Webb stood in the driveway of a decaying Virginia farm, looking at a man who was half a head shorter and 20 pounds lighter than him, and for the first time in what was probably a very long time, he was unsure. Not afraid. Men like Marcus didn't do afraid, not in any way they'd admit, but unsure. Uncertain of the math, unable to calculate whether the man in front of him was bluffing or not, and unable to accept the consequences of guessing wrong. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said. "Wouldn't be my first. Charlotte doesn't belong here. She doesn't belong with whatever this is." He gestured at the farm, the barn, Daniel. Dismissive, comprehensive. "She's brilliant. She built something extraordinary, and she's throwing it away hiding on some backwoods property with a man who fixes fences for a living. Get in the car, Marcus." Axel took one step forward, just one, but the step was slow and deliberate, and accompanied by a sound from deep in his chest. Not a growl, not a bark. Something lower and more primal. A vibration that traveled through the ground and up through the soles of Marcus's expensive shoes. The dog's eyes were locked on him, unblinking, two pools of amber fire that held no negotiation and no mercy. Marcus looked at the dog. The dog looked back. "This isn't over," Marcus said. "It is here." Marcus Webb turned, walked to the SUV, opened the door, and paused. He looked back at the farmhouse one more time, at the peeling paint, the repaired porch, the curtains in the windows, the mason jar of dried flowers barely visible through the kitchen glass. His face did something complicated, some mixture of contempt and confusion, and buried deep beneath both, something that might have been loss. The recognition that the woman he'd taken everything from had found something he couldn't buy, couldn't leverage, couldn't take. He got in the car. The engine started. The SUV backed down the driveway, reached the road, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the afternoon air like a question mark. Daniel stood in the driveway until the dust settled. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. Axel was still beside him, still in that locked, watchful position, still ready. The dog wouldn't stand down until Daniel told him to, and Daniel wasn't ready to give that order yet. He needed a moment. He needed the adrenaline to finish its circuit through his bloodstream and dissipate into the ordinary chemicals of a body at rest. He heard the front door open. Charlotte was on the porch. She was gripping the railing with both hands, and her face was the color of the plywood he'd been measuring in the barn, pale, flat, drained of everything except the effort of remaining upright. She was shaking, not the subtle tremor he'd seen in the kitchen the night after Megan's visit. This was visible, whole body, the kind of shaking that comes from adrenaline dump and fear, and the sudden disorienting relief of a threat that approached and retreated without making contact. Daniel crossed the yard, climbed the porch steps, stood in front of her. "He's gone," he said. Charlotte nodded. She couldn't speak. Her mouth was open, but nothing came out, and Daniel could see the effort it was costing her to maintain even this level of composure. The muscles in her jaw working, the tendons in her neck tight as cables, her knuckles white on the porch railing. "Hey," he said softly. "He's gone. He's not coming back." "You don't know that." "I know that if he does, I'll be here." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright and wet and ferocious, not with tears, but with the particular intensity of a woman who had spent her entire adult life solving problems alone and was standing on a porch in rural Virginia facing the possibility that she might not have to. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care? We have an arrangement. I clean, you provide a room. That's what we agreed. You don't owe me, Charlotte. You don't owe me protection. You don't owe me anything. I'm a stranger who showed up at your gate with nothing and—" "Charlotte." She stopped. Her breathing was ragged, fast, the breaths of someone who was running while standing still. "You're not a stranger," Daniel said. "You stopped being a stranger about 5 weeks ago, somewhere around the time you alphabetized my spice rack and taught my dog to beg." A sound escaped her, half laugh, half something else, something rawer and less controlled. Her grip on the railing loosened. Her shoulders dropped. The shaking didn't stop, but it changed, slowed, softened, became the trembling of someone who was releasing something rather than fighting it. Axel climbed the porch steps. He walked past Daniel, walked past the spot where he always positioned himself between Daniel and other humans, and stopped directly beside Charlotte. He sat down and leaned his full weight against her leg, pressing into her the way he pressed into Daniel during the bad moments, the flashback moments, the moments when the world got too loud, and the only anchor was 60 pounds of warm, breathing certainty. Charlotte looked down at the dog. Her hand came off the railing and settled on his head, gently, like she was touching something she was afraid of breaking. Axel's eyes closed. His tail swept the porch boards once. "He's never done that with anyone," Daniel said quietly. "Just me." Charlotte's fingers moved through the dog's fur. A tear slipped down her cheek. One, singular, the first he'd ever seen from her. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, let it land on Axel's coat, let it be witnessed by the man standing in front of her, and the dog leaning against her, and the empty driveway where a black SUV had been and wasn't anymore. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel didn't say "you're welcome," didn't say it was nothing, didn't say any of the things people say when someone thanks them for something that matters. He just stood there, 3 feet away, his hands at his sides, and he let Charlotte Vance cry one tear on his porch, while his dog held her up. And he understood, fully, finally, without ambiguity or escape, that the wall he'd spent 3 years building was gone. Not cracked, not damaged, gone. Reduced to rubble by a woman who hadn't even tried to knock it down. She'd just made it irrelevant. The days after Marcus left were quiet in a way that felt earned. Not the empty silence Daniel had constructed over 3 years of isolation, and not the fragile silence of two people afraid to say the wrong thing. This was the quiet that comes after a storm passes and the ground is still wet, and the air smells like ozone and possibility. And you stand outside and look at the damage and think, okay, we're still here. Now what? Charlotte didn't mention Marcus, Daniel didn't push, but something between them had shifted in a fundamental structural way, the way a foundation shifts after an earthquake. Not destroyed, but permanently rearranged. The distance they'd maintained, that careful, measured gap between their bodies and their words and their eyes, had narrowed. Not to zero, but close enough that the gap itself became the most noticeable thing in any room they shared. She was 8 months now. The baby sat low and heavy, and Charlotte moved through the house with a different gait. Slower, wider, one hand drifting to her lower back more often than she probably realized. She still worked. She still cooked, still cleaned, still attacked domestic tasks with the focused intensity of a woman who equated productivity with worth. But there were concessions her body was making whether she approved of them or not. She napped in the afternoons, short, reluctant naps on the couch, with a blanket over her legs, and Axel lying on the floor beside her, close enough that his breathing synced with hers. She let Daniel carry the groceries. She stopped climbing on chairs. "I'm not fragile," she said one evening when Daniel took a heavy pot from her hands without asking. "I know." "Then stop treating me like I am." "I'm not treating you like you're fragile. I'm treating you like you're 8 months pregnant and that pot weighs 15 pounds. It weighs 10. Charlotte." She let go of the pot. Their fingers touched during the transfer. A brief accidental contact that sent a jolt through Daniel's hand and up his arm and into his chest, where it lodged like a splinter he couldn't reach. Charlotte felt it too. He knew because she pulled her hand back a half-second faster than the transfer required, and her eyes went to the floor, and a flush crept up the side of her neck that she covered by turning toward the stove. They were dancing around it. Both of them knew. Axel probably knew. The dog had taken to sleeping in the hallway between their bedroom doors at night, equidistant from both, like a furry, demilitarized zone maintaining the peace between two territories that were increasingly interested in merging. It was a Thursday night, 9 weeks since Charlotte had walked up the driveway, 9 weeks since Daniel had broken his 11-month silence to tell a pregnant stranger where the blankets were, when something finally broke through. They were on the porch, their spot, their ritual. The November air was cold enough to see their breath, and Charlotte was wrapped in a quilt she'd found in the hall closet, her feet tucked under her on the bench, a mug of chamomile tea balanced on the armrest. Daniel was on the step. Axel was between them, his head resting on Charlotte's thigh. A position he'd adopted 3 days ago without ceremony or explanation, as if it had always been this way, and everyone else was just catching up. I talked to my lawyer today, Charlotte said. Daniel looked at her. She'd used the landline in the kitchen, the one he kept for emergencies, the one that barely got a signal, and he'd heard fragments of the conversation through the closed door. Legal terms, dollar amounts, a voice that sounded like Charlotte, but harder, colder, the voice of a woman who'd once sat at the head of a boardroom table and made decisions that moved markets. And the board is fracturing. 3 members are contesting Marcus's restructuring. They're filing a motion to reinstate me as CEO, pending a full forensic audit of the share transfers. That sounds good. It sounds like war. She stared out at the dark hills. It'll take months, maybe a year. Depositions, hearings, discovery. My lawyer says Marcus is already hiring a second legal team, corporate defense specialists out of New York. He's going to fight this like his life depends on it, because it does. If the audit proves what I know it'll prove, he doesn't just lose the company. He faces criminal charges, securities fraud, fiduciary breach, maybe worse. Can you win? Charlotte turned to him. In the porch light, her face was sharp and certain, the face of a woman who had built something from nothing once and was entirely prepared to do it again. I will win. It's not a question of whether, it's a question of how long it takes and how much damage he does on the way down. What do you need? Right now? Nothing. My lawyers are handling the filings. The forensic accountants are building the case. Marcus's own paper trail is going to bury him. He wasn't careful because he didn't think I'd fight back. He thought I'd take the settlement and disappear. He doesn't know you very well. He never did. That was his biggest mistake. She paused. Her hand moved to her belly. The gesture that had become as natural and constant as breathing, the unconscious check, the reassurance. My second biggest mistake was thinking love and understanding were the same thing. Marcus understood me. He understood what I'd built, what it was worth, how the pieces fit together. But understanding someone's value isn't the same as valuing them. He saw a balance sheet where he should have seen a person. Daniel was quiet for a long time. The owl was calling from the tree line, the same owl, the same rusty hinge sound, their nightly companion since October. Axel's ear twitched toward it, then back. When it's over, Daniel said, when you win, what happens? I go back, I take the company, I rebuild what he broke. You leave. He said it without inflection, without emotion, a flat statement of fact that was designed to sound neutral and failed completely. Charlotte heard it. He knew she heard it because she went very still, the way she always did when something hit her in a place she hadn't armored. Daniel, it's fine. You came here for a reason. The reason will end. You'll go back to your life. Is that what you want? It's what makes sense. That's not what I asked. He turned to look at her. She was watching him with those dark eyes that saw through walls, through defenses, through every structure he'd ever built to keep people at a distance. And he was so tired. Tired of the distance, tired of the walls, tired of telling himself that the space between them was protection when it was really just loneliness in a dress uniform. No, he said, it's not what I want. Then say what you want. I don't know how. Try. He looked at his hands, rough, scarred, calloused from fence posts and firewood and a decade of holding weapons. Hands that had been trained to build and destroy in equal measure, that knew 100 ways to take a life and couldn't figure out how to reach across 3 feet of porch and hold someone else's. I want you to stay, he said. The words came out rough and awkward and unpolished, the verbal equivalent of a first draft, and he didn't try to fix them. I know that's selfish. I know your life is somewhere else, and this farm is... I know what this farm is. I know what I am. I'm a guy who fixes fences and doesn't sleep and flinches when pans drop. I'm not... He stopped, swallowed. I'm not what someone like you ends up with. Someone like me. Charlotte, you're worth $2 billion. I'm worth nothing right now. My accounts are frozen. I own the clothes on my back, half of which are yours. I can't even buy my own groceries. That's temporary. So is everything. She shifted on the bench, turning to face him more fully. The quilt slipped off one shoulder. She didn't fix it. You want to know what I was thinking the night I walked up your driveway? I was thinking, If this person says no, I'll sleep in the truck again, and the truck doesn't have heat, and the baby will be cold, and I'll figure it out because I always figure it out, because that's what I do, because no one has ever. Her voice cracked. Not the controlled composure she usually maintained, not the careful, measured delivery of a woman accustomed to boardrooms and negotiations. A crack, real and raw, and unguarded. No one has ever just been there. My whole life, Daniel. My whole life I've been figuring it out alone, building alone, losing alone. And then I walked up a dirt driveway and a stranger with a terrifying dog gave me a room with a broken radiator and didn't ask me a single question about who I was or where I came from or what I deserved. And for the first time She stopped, pressed her hand to her mouth, breathed. Axel lifted his head from her thigh and looked up at her face. And then he did something Daniel had never seen him do in 3 years of ownership. He whined, a soft, sustained whine that wasn't about food or attention or a command. It was distress. The dog was responding to Charlotte's pain the way he'd been trained to respond to his handler's pain, with the instinctive, irresistible empathy of an animal who didn't understand language but understood suffering perfectly. Daniel stood up from the step. He crossed the 3 feet of porch between them, the 3 feet that had been an ocean for 9 weeks, that had been a boundary and a border and a line neither of them had crossed, and he sat beside her on the bench. Not touching, but close. Close enough that she could feel his warmth in the November air, could smell the wood smoke and the soap, and the particular human scent of a man who'd spent the day working with his hands. "I didn't give you that room because I'm generous," he said. "I gave it to you because you didn't beg. Everyone who's ever needed something from me, the Navy, Megan, my mother, they all came asking me to be something, do something, feel something. You showed up at my gate in bad boots with a baby in your belly, and you didn't ask for a thing. You offered to work. You offered your hands. And I thought—" He paused, tried to find words that were honest without being bigger than the moment could hold. "I thought, here's someone who understands that you don't get to just take from people. You have to give something first." Charlotte's hand came off her mouth. She was looking at him with wet eyes and a clenched jaw and an expression that was fighting itself. The CEO who built empires battling the pregnant woman on a porch, who was being seen, maybe for the first time, by someone who didn't want anything from her except her presence. "I'm going to have this baby soon," she said. "Probably within the month." "I know. I'm scared." "I know. I've never been scared of anything in my professional life. Not a single board meeting, not a single investor pitch, not a single negotiation. But the idea of being responsible for a human being who can't do anything for himself, who's going to need me for everything, who's going to look at me and expect me to know what I'm doing." She laughed, short and wet. "I'm terrified." "You think I wasn't terrified when I got Axel? 60 pounds of trauma and teeth, and the kennel told me he'd probably never adjust, and I brought him home to a falling-apart farm and thought, what am I doing? I can barely take care of myself. And now he sleeps with his head on my leg. And now he sleeps with his head on your leg." She reached over and took his hand, just like that. No hesitation, no warning, no slow approach. She reached over and wrapped her fingers around his, and Daniel's brain short-circuited in a way that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with the fact that another person was holding his hand on a porch in Virginia and he didn't want to pull away. Her hand was warm, smaller than his, but strong, the grip she'd used during their first handshake, the one that compensated for something. Only now it didn't feel like compensation. It felt like certainty. "Stay with me," she said. "Not on this porch. Not for tonight. Stay with me through this. The baby, the lawsuit, the rebuilding. I don't know what happens after. I can't promise you a timeline or a plan or a neat resolution, but I can promise you that I won't disappear. I won't leave without telling you, and I won't ask you to be anything other than exactly what you are." Daniel looked at their hands, his scarred, hers steady, intertwined in the porch light like a knot that had been waiting to be tied. "I'm broken," he said. "You should know that. Not metaphorically, clinically. I have nights where I don't sleep for 72 hours. I have mornings where I can't leave the bedroom because the door feels like a hatch and the hallway feels like a corridor, and my body thinks it's somewhere it's not. The pan thing, the flinching, that's the mild version. The bad version is worse. I know. You don't know the half of it. Then tell me the other half. Not tonight. Not all at once. But tell me, because I'd rather know the worst of someone who's real than the best of someone who's performing." He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. Axel settled his head on both their laps, covering the point where their hands met, as if to say, "Finally." They sat on the porch for a long time after that. The owl called. The stars appeared. The November wind pushed against the farmhouse, and the farmhouse pushed back, the way it always had, the way old things do. Not gracefully, not perfectly, but stubbornly, persistently, with the accumulated resistance of a structure that has survived every season that tried to take it down. The baby came 3 weeks later. A Tuesday, December. Charlotte woke Daniel at 4 a.m. by knocking on his bedroom door. Not frantic, not panicked. 3 measured knocks that said, "This is happening. Get up. We need to go." He was dressed in under a minute. She was already at the bottom of the stairs, her overnight bag, packed for 2 weeks, sitting by the front door like a soldier waiting for deployment orders, in one hand, the other gripping the banister. "How far apart?" Daniel asked. 8 minutes. Started about an hour ago." "An hour? Why didn't you wake me?" "Because 8 minutes is plenty of time, and I wanted to be sure it was real." Her face contorted briefly. A contraction, the muscles of her abdomen tightening visibly under her shirt, and she breathed through it with her eyes closed and her lips pressed together, a sound coming from deep in her throat that was half exhale and half something more primal. Daniel took the bag. He opened the front door. Axel was already there, standing at attention, reading the room with the precision of a combat dog who understood that something significant was happening, even if he didn't understand what. "Can he come?" Charlotte asked. "He's not a therapy dog." "Daniel, can he come?" They loaded into the truck. Charlotte in the passenger seat, Daniel driving, Axel in the back seat with his head between them, nose inches from Charlotte's shoulder. The drive to the hospital in Charlottesville was 47 minutes under normal conditions. Daniel made it in 31. He drove the way he did everything since the Navy. Controlled, focused, fast without being reckless, reading the road ahead with the same anticipatory awareness he'd once used to read terrain. Charlotte didn't scream. She didn't cry. She breathed through each contraction with the concentrated focus of someone who had decided that this, like everything else in her life, would be handled through discipline and willpower and an absolute refusal to lose control. Between contractions, she talked. "I had a birth plan," she said, gripping the door handle. "I wrote it in my second trimester. It was 12 pages long. It had contingencies, subsections, a flow chart." "Of course it did. It's in the overnight bag." "Do you need it?" "No. It was a way of pretending I could control this. Turns out, another contraction." She hissed through her teeth, her body curving forward against the seatbelt. "Turns out babies don't care about flow charts." The hospital was a blur. Daniel pulled up to the emergency entrance, got Charlotte into a wheelchair that a nurse materialized with, and then stood in the parking lot with Axel and realized he didn't know what to do next. He wasn't family. He wasn't the father. He was a man who'd met this woman 9 weeks ago, and the institutional machinery of a hospital had no category for what they were to each other. Charlotte solved it from the wheelchair, already being pushed through the automatic doors, by turning around and saying, in a voice that carried across the parking lot with the authority of someone who'd once commanded a billion-dollar company, "He's with me. His name is Daniel Brooks. Let him in." They let him in. The labor lasted 11 hours. 11 hours of Charlotte doing the hardest physical work of her life in a hospital gown on a bed, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and latex, and the particular chemical neutrality of institutions. Daniel sat in a chair beside the bed. He held her hand when she wanted it held, and let go when she pulled away. He got her ice chips and adjusted the pillow behind her back, and at one point, around hour 6, when the contractions were 3 minutes apart, and the pain was visible on her face like weather on a landscape, she looked at him and said, "Talk to me about something. Anything. The fence? Tell me about the fence." So he talked about the south pasture fence, the rotting posts, the type of wood he was using for replacements, pressure-treated pine, because cedar was too expensive and oak was too heavy. The way you set a post, dig the hole twice as wide as the post, fill the bottom with gravel for drainage, plumb it with a level, pack the dirt in layers. He talked for 20 minutes about fence posts while Charlotte breathed through contractions that were 2 minutes apart, and the nurse gave him a look that said, "This is the strangest labor coaching I've ever witnessed," and Charlotte gripped his hand and listened to every word. "You're good at this," she said between contractions. "Fence posts? Being here. You're good at being here." It was the simplest compliment anyone had ever given him, and it broke something open in his chest that had been sealed shut for a very long time. Elias was born at 3:47 p.m., 6 pounds, 11 ounces. Dark hair, red face, lungs that announced themselves to the world with a scream that was furious and beautiful and completely uninterested in being quiet or polite or measured. He came into the world the way his mother had arrived at Daniel's farm, loud, determined, and unwilling to wait for an invitation. The nurse placed him on Charlotte's chest. Charlotte's hands, the hands that had built a company, scrubbed a farmhouse, taken Daniel's on a cold porch, those hands curved around her son with a tenderness that was so fierce and so vulnerable at the same time that Daniel had to look away. Not because it was too much, because it was exactly enough, and he wasn't sure he deserved to witness it. "Hey," Charlotte whispered to the baby. "Hey, I'm your mom. I know. It's cold out here, and it's bright, and it's loud, and none of this makes sense, but I've got you. I've got you." The baby's scream subsided to a hiccup, then to a series of small, wet sounds that were the beginning of a conversation between mother and child that would last the rest of their lives. Charlotte looked up at Daniel. Her face was wrecked, exhausted, swollen, streaked with tears and sweat, her hair matted against her forehead, her hospital gown askew. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he didn't mean that the way poets mean it, with soft lighting and perfect angles. He meant it the way a man means it when he's spent 3 years alone and suddenly understands what he was missing. Not the idealized version, not the fantasy, but the real, imperfect, devastating fact of another person who chose to let you in. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked. Daniel's hands were shaking, not the combat tremor. Something else, something new. "I don't—" He stopped, looked at his hands, the scars, the calluses, hands that had been designed for a very different purpose than holding a 6-pound infant. "What if I—" "You won't. Charlotte, I've never—" "Daniel, take your son." The word landed like a depth charge. Your son, not the baby, not Elias. Your son." He stared at her. She stared back. And in her eyes, tired, red-rimmed, stripped of every defense she'd ever built, he saw that she meant it. Not biologically, not legally, but in the way that mattered, the way that would hold up, not in a courtroom, but in a kitchen, on a porch, in the hallway of a farmhouse at 3 a.m., when a baby was crying and someone had to get up. He took the baby. Elias was warm, impossibly warm, the kind of warm that comes from the inside, from cells that are brand new and working at full capacity for the first time. He weighed nothing. He weighed everything. Daniel held him against his chest with the same instinctive care he'd once used to hold equipment that could save lives or end them, and the baby made a sound, a small, uncertain sound, half protest and half exploration, and then settled against Daniel's heartbeat and went quiet. "See?" Charlotte said. "He knows." "Knows what?" "Safe. He knows safe." Daniel looked at the baby's face, eyes closed, mouth working, fists clenched against the unfamiliar air. A brand new person in a complicated world, with a mother who'd lost everything and a man who wasn't his father standing in a hospital room holding him like he was the most important thing that had ever existed. Because he was. They came home on Thursday. Daniel drove even slower on the way back, 20 under the speed limit, hands at 10 and 2, checking the rearview mirror every 30 seconds like the road behind them might produce a threat. Charlotte sat in the back seat with Elias in the car seat beside her, one hand on his chest, feeling the tiny rise and fall of breathing that she was going to monitor obsessively for the foreseeable future, because that's what new mothers do. They count breaths like accountants count money, each one a small deposit in the bank of being alive. Axel was in the passenger seat. He'd been waiting in the truck when they came out of the hospital. Daniel had left the windows cracked and driven back twice a day to feed him and walk him. And the dog had accepted this arrangement with the patient resignation of someone who understood the mission had changed, and his role had been temporarily redefined. But when they opened the back door and he saw the car seat, something happened. His head extended forward. His nostrils flared. He inhaled, one long, sustained intake of air that cataloged every molecule of the new human's scent. And then he did something extraordinary. He licked Daniel's hand. Then he turned around, lay down on the passenger seat, and faced forward, eyes on the road, body relaxed. On duty, new assignment, accepted. The farmhouse had never been designed for a baby. There was no nursery, no crib, no changing table, no white noise machine or mobile with felt animals, or any of the 1,000 items that the modern parenting industrial complex insisted were essential for human infant survival. What there was a bedroom upstairs with a radiator that worked about half the time, a woman who'd run a billion-dollar company and could certainly manage a 7-pound human, and a man who'd spent 12 years keeping people alive in conditions significantly worse than a farmhouse in Virginia. They figured it out. The way people have always figured it out, not with perfect preparation and optimal resources, but with stubbornness and improvisation and the willingness to fail at 2 a.m. and try again at 2:15. Charlotte was extraordinary with the baby and terrible at asking for help. She'd nurse Elias, burp him, change him, rock him, put him down, and then stand in the hallway looking like a woman who'd been hit by a truck, physically wrung out. And when Daniel said, "Let me take him for a while," she'd say, "I'm fine," with the same stubborn conviction she'd brought to everything since the day she arrived. "You're not fine," Daniel said on the third night, at 4 a.m., standing in the hallway in his boxers and a t-shirt, while Charlotte paced with a screaming Elias against her shoulder. "You haven't slept more than 40 minutes at a stretch in 3 days. Newborns don't sleep. This is normal. You not sleeping isn't normal. Give me the baby. Daniel, Charlotte, give me the baby." She looked at him in the dark hallway. This man she'd known for 10 weeks. This stranger who wasn't a stranger. This person who'd stood between her and Marcus Webb and said no with a voice that left no room for discussion. And something in her finally gave. Not broke. Gave. The way a muscle gives after too long under tension, not in failure, but in release. She handed Elias to Daniel. The baby screamed for 8 more minutes. Daniel walked the hallway, back and forth, a slow, measured patrol that wasn't so different from the perimeter checks he did every evening. Same rhythm, same pace, same quiet focus. He held Elias against his chest, the baby's head tucked under his chin, and he didn't rock or bounce or sing or do any of the things the parenting books probably recommended. He just walked, steady, present, there. Elias stopped screaming at the 8-minute mark. He hiccuped twice, made a sound like a question, and fell asleep. Charlotte, watching from her bedroom doorway, slid down the doorframe and sat on the floor and cried. Not one tear this time. The full thing, shoulders shaking, hands over her face, the accumulated exhaustion and fear and relief and gratitude of a woman who had been carrying everything alone for so long that the act of someone else carrying something, even for a few minutes, was enough to undo her completely. Daniel walked the sleeping baby to her. He sat on the floor beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, holding Elias, while Charlotte cried. And Axel appeared from Daniel's bedroom and lay down across both their legs. And the farmhouse held all 4 of them in the pre-dawn dark, like a hand closing gently around something it wanted to protect. The weeks after that were chaos and exhaustion, and something else, something that didn't have a name but felt like the early stages of a structure being built, one brick at a time, by people who'd never built this particular kind of thing before and were learning as they went. Daniel became a person he didn't recognize. Not in a dramatic, transformative way. He was still the same man, still quiet, still guarded, still flinching at loud sounds and walking the perimeter every evening and locking his bedroom door out of habit even though the door didn't mean what it used to mean. But there were additions. New behaviors layered over the old ones like plaster over exposed brick. He learned to change a diaper one-handed while holding a bottle in the other. He learned that babies have preferences about how they're held. Elias liked facing outward, one of Daniel's arms across his chest, looking at the world with the wide-eyed intensity of someone who'd arrived recently and was still taking inventory. He learned that you could love something you hadn't made. That biology was one way to build a family, and stubbornness was another, and showing up at 3 a.m. when someone needed you was a third. Charlotte's lawyers called every few days. The case was building. Marcus had retained his second firm, as predicted, and the legal maneuvering had begun in earnest. Motions and countermotions. Depositions scheduled and rescheduled, the slow, grinding machinery of corporate litigation that consumed money and time and emotional bandwidth in equal measure. Charlotte handled it the way she handled everything, methodically, intensely, with a focus that would have been impressive if it weren't also exhausting. She took calls in the kitchen with the door closed, her voice shifting into that other register. Harder, faster. The voice of a CEO who had been knocked down and was in the process of standing back up. Daniel heard fragments, forensic evidence, forged signatures, a paper trail that Marcus had been too arrogant to cover properly because he'd assumed Charlotte would never fight back. The lawyers were optimistic. The board was fracturing further. 2 more members had joined the motion to reinstate her, citing fiduciary concerns and potential personal liability. "He's going to lose," Charlotte told Daniel one evening after a 2-hour call that left her sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands and Elias asleep in the portable bassinet beside her. The forensic audit found discrepancies in 7 separate share transfers. His own chief financial officer is cooperating. "How long?" "My lawyers say the reinstatement hearing could happen within 2 months. The criminal referral is already with the SEC. And then?" She looked up. Elias was making the small rhythmic sounds of a baby dreaming, soft clicks and murmurs that filled the kitchen like music from a radio in another room. Charlotte's eyes moved from the baby to Daniel, and in that look was the question they'd both been carrying since the night on the porch, the question that lived in the space between what they'd built here and what was waiting for her in a different world. "I've been thinking about that," she said. And I don't have an answer yet, but I have a question." "Okay. Would you come with me?" Daniel blinked. "To Baltimore?" "To wherever. The company's headquarters is in Baltimore, but I can work remotely for most of it. I can restructure the board from anywhere with a phone and a laptop. The question isn't where the company is. The question is where we are. We. We, you, me, Elias, and the 60-pound fur missile who's currently asleep on my bedroom floor, even though he has a perfectly good bed downstairs." Daniel leaned back in his chair. He looked at the kitchen that Charlotte had transformed, the clean counters and the organized shelves and the mason jar on the table that now held fresh flowers instead of dried ones, because Charlotte had planted something in the window box and it had grown. He looked through the archway at the living room, the throw pillows, the books on the shelves, the wood stove that burned clean. He looked at the window, where the first light of a Virginia morning was beginning to color the horizon. "This farm is a wreck," he said. "It's less of a wreck than it was 10 weeks ago. The barn still leans, the tractor's still dead, half the fields are still choked with saplings. So we fix them. Charlotte, you're about to take back a $2 billion company. You can't run a corporation from a farm in the Blue Ridge foothills. Watch me." He looked at her. She looked back. And there it was, that steel, that refusal, that absolute unwillingness to accept that things had to be one way when she'd already decided they could be another. The same quality that had built a company from a laptop in a studio apartment. The same quality that had walked up a dirt driveway and offered to work instead of begging for shelter. The same quality that had survived Marcus Webb and a frozen bank account and a cross-country drive in a dying truck, and had emerged on the other side not just intact but stronger. "You're serious," he said. "I've never been more serious about anything, and I say that as someone who once convinced a room of 40 investors to fund a startup based on a napkin sketch and a 15-minute pitch. Must have been a good napkin." "It was a great napkin." She reached across the table. He took her hand. It was warm and strong, and it didn't shake. "Daniel, I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm not asking you to wear khakis or go to farmers markets or pretend to like college football. I'm asking you to be exactly who you are, quiet, stubborn, broken in all the ways that make you real, and to be that person next to me instead of alone." In the bassinet, Elias stirred. His fist emerged from the blanket, clenched around nothing, grasping at air with the instinctive urgency of someone who doesn't yet know that the thing he's reaching for is already within reach. Daniel looked at his son. Not his biological son. His son. The child he'd held in a hospital room and walked through a dark hallway and fed at 4 a.m. while Charlotte finally slept, the small human who'd arrived screaming and had slowly, over weeks, learned to settle against Daniel's chest the way Axel settled against his leg, with the trust of a creature who had decided, through some calculus that required no logic and no evidence, that this person was safe. "Okay," Daniel said. "Okay. Yeah, okay. But I'm not selling the farm." Charlotte's face broke into a smile. Not the almost smile, not the guarded half expression, but the full thing, wide and imperfect and slightly crooked, the smile she'd been holding back since the night she walked up his driveway, the smile she'd been protecting behind walls as thick as his own. "I wouldn't dream of it," she said. He stood up, he walked around the table, he leaned down and kissed her. Not perfectly, not smoothly, not the way it happens in movies where the lighting is good and the music swells and both people know exactly what to do. It was awkward. His nose bumped hers. She laughed against his mouth. Elias chose that exact moment to wake up and begin a protest that was entirely disproportionate to whatever had disturbed him. Axel appeared in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation, and walked over to the bassinet, where he lay down beside it with the resigned competence of a professional who understood that his job description had expanded. It was messy. It was clumsy. It was imperfect and unrehearsed, and nothing like what either of them would have scripted if they'd been given the chance to plan it. It was real. And that was the thing that mattered more than the billion-dollar company or the legal battle or the farmhouse that still needed a new roof and a working tractor, and about 50 other things that would take years to fix. The thing that mattered was this: two people who had been broken by different wars, who had built walls so high they'd forgotten what the sky looked like from the other side, had found each other on a dirt road in Virginia and decided, not because it was easy, not because it made sense, not because anyone told them to, but because they chose to. They chose to stay. They chose to try. They chose the terrifying, irrational, completely human act of building something together when everything in their history said they were better off building alone. The farm didn't become beautiful. It became functional, and then it became home. And those aren't the same thing, but the second one is better. Charlotte ran her company from the kitchen table for the first 3 months, then from an office she built in the converted barn, the same barn that had been leaning 15 degrees when she arrived, that Daniel straightened with new supports, and Charlotte wired for internet, and Axel claimed a corner of as his personal quarters. The legal battle with Marcus Webb ended not with a dramatic courtroom scene, but with a settlement conference in a law office in Baltimore, where Marcus's own attorneys advised him to accept the terms Charlotte's team had drafted because the alternative, a public trial with the forensic evidence on display, would have been worse than losing. He lost the company. He lost the money. He lost the criminal case that followed, though the sentence was lighter than Charlotte thought it should be. She didn't attend the sentencing. She was on the farm. Elias had learned to crawl, and the farmhouse wasn't baby-proofed, and there was a corner of the coffee table that Daniel was convinced was going to end someone's life. Charlotte spent the afternoon on the living room floor with Elias, while Daniel sanded the edges of every piece of furniture in the house, and Axel lay in the doorway watching the baby with the focused intensity of a dog who had been assigned to protection detail and took the assignment as seriously as any he'd had in the military. "He's going to be fine," Charlotte said, watching Daniel sandpaper the corner of a bookshelf. "He's going to crack his head open. Babies are resilient. Babies are soft. Their skulls have gaps in them. Did you know that? Actual gaps." "I know that, Daniel. I grew one." He looked at her. She was smiling, that real smile, the one that had become more frequent but never routine, the one that still surprised him every time, like a flash of sunlight on a cloudy day. Elias was on his hands and knees between them, rocking forward and backward with the determined, furrowed concentration of someone who was absolutely going to figure this out, even if it took all afternoon. "He looks like you when he does that," Daniel said. "Does what?" "That face. The one that says, 'I will accomplish this task or die trying.' That's not a face. That's a lifestyle." He laughed. An actual laugh. Short, rough, unused, The laugh of a man who'd forgotten he had one and was rediscovering it in increments. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly. She'd heard him almost laugh before, heard the ghost of it, but the real thing was different. Warmer, more human. The sound of a wall that wasn't there anymore. Elias made it 4 feet across the living room floor that afternoon, a distance that was, by any objective measure, insignificant, and that felt, to the 3 people and 1 dog watching it happen, like the most important journey anyone had ever completed. Daniel Brooks had spent 3 years alone on a dying farm with a dog who trusted no one, waiting for nothing, building silence like a man building a bunker. Brick by brick, room by room, a structure designed to keep the world out and himself in. He'd believed, with the certainty of a person who'd been trained to read situations and calculate odds, that this was the best outcome available, that the math of his life added up to this. Solitude plus survival equals a number you could live with, even if living with it was the same as barely living at all. He'd been wrong, not because solitude was bad or survival was insufficient, but because the math was incomplete. He'd been solving for one variable, himself, and hadn't accounted for the possibility that the equation could change, that a stranger could walk up a driveway in October and rewrite the formula entirely, that a baby could be born in a hospital in Charlottesville and at a term he'd never considered, that a dog could learn to trust again, and that watching it happen could teach a man that he could too. The farm survived. Not perfectly. The roof still leaked when it rained hard, and the tractor was a project that Daniel was going to get to eventually, and there was a section of the south fence that needed replacing again because the ground shifted in spring, and posts that seemed solid in November were crooked by April. But it survived. The way old things survive, through stubbornness, through repair, through the accumulated decision made every day to keep standing. Charlotte Vance took back her company, rebuilt it, tripled its value in 2 years, and did most of it from a barn in the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia, while a Belgian Malinois slept at her feet, and a baby grew into a toddler who called Daniel Da, because nobody had told him not to, and nobody wanted to. And Daniel, who hadn't spoken to another human for 11 months before Charlotte arrived, who'd flinched at dropped pans and locked his bedroom door every night, and walked the perimeter like a man patrolling a base that existed only in his memory, Daniel learned something that the Navy had never taught him, and that 3 years of isolation had done its best to make him forget. That the bravest thing a person can do isn't building walls, it's letting someone through them. Not because the walls were wrong, and not because the person on the other side has earned it, and not because some voice from the sky told you to open the gate, but because you're standing there at midnight, alone, with your dog, in a house that echoes, and someone knocks. And you choose, despite everything, despite every scar and every lesson and every reason not to, you choose to answer. He chose to answer. That's the whole story. That's all of it. 3 broken lives on 62 acres, held together not by perfection or destiny or some grand cosmic design, but by the stubborn, imperfect, deeply human choice to stay